Indian Removal. By Grant Foreman. Foreword by Angie Debo. West Wyandotte, Kansas City, KANS. Public Library. Date. B. Indian Removal. The Civilization of the American Indian Series. University of Oklahoma Press. Norman. The Emigration of the Five Civilized Tribes of Indians by Grant Foreman. Foreword by Angie Debo. 2. Robert L. Williams, who has done so much to make and to preserve Oklahoma history. Foreword by Angie Debo. Just before the turn of the present century, young Grant Foreman came out to the Indian Territory from Chicago as an attorney to work for the Dawes Commission, which was liquidating the five civilized tribes. These Indians, Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, had lived for uncounted centuries in the Gulf and southern Appalachian region, but had been removed to the uncharted West 2 generations before. There they had owned and governed the Indian Territory until now, when their tribal affairs were being terminated in preparation for Oklahoma statehood. Foreman served as a field worker in dividing their tribal land into individual holdings. In 1903 he resigned his position with the commission and entered into a law partnership with John R. Thomas of Muskogee, who had come to the territory 7 years earlier as a federal judge. In 1905 he married the judge's daughter, Carolyn. In his work with the Dawes Commission and in his later legal practice, Foreman was engaged in solving intricate problems involving land disputes based on the unwritten history of the area. This aroused an interest that never flagged. In the early 1920s, having established a competence through oil and farm holdings, he gave up his active law practice and devoted the rest of his life to an arduous career of uncovering and recording the history of Oklahoma and its Indians, a task relieved only by his active leadership in historical movements and his unfailing assistance to other writers. He once said, "To me there is no avocation, no occupation so interesting and so fascinating, none that offers such rich rewards in proportion to the industry and application devoted, as historical research. To follow a clue to the lair of an elusive historical event, to capture the fact and make it my own, brings a glow of satisfaction I would not yield to any big game hunter. Or if the metaphorical hunter may become a gold seeker, whether toilfully digging in low pay dirt or in the mother lode of rich old historical records, the treasure I extract there not only dims the glitter of the yellow metal for pure joy of discovery and possession, but it has the greater value of being mine forever to share with others, without fear of theft or loss." With the help of his gifted wife, a historian in her own right, he combed through documents in the basements of government buildings and public and private collections throughout the United States. The couple also traveled widely in other countries, working in the Public Record Office in London and other foreign archives. Once in a neglected heap of papers in India they found a document for which they had searched in vain at home. In those days before duplicating machines, everything had to be copied painfully by hand or typewriter, but as Foreman wrote in one of his prefaces, the fascination of this employment has relieved it of much of its drudgery. Persons familiar with his writing will recall how often he uses the word interesting to characterize a situation or event. His first book, Pioneers in the Early Southwest, was published in 1926. It was followed 4 years later by Indians and Pioneers. These books presented a lively history of a region that had been a blank space on the map and in the annals of westward expansion. This was the setting of the present volume. As he himself wrote in the last paragraph of Indians and Pioneers, so closed a period of preparation of this southwestern country for its participation in a dramatic experiment with a race of people, unsurpassed in interest and pathos in our history. A wild and lawless expanse of beautiful country, was on the eve of a great change. A decade then just beginning was to witness the immigration of more than 60,000 Indians, torn from their homes in the East. His Indian Removal takes up the story from there. It was published in 1932 by the newly founded University of Oklahoma Press, the second volume in its Civilization of the American Indian series, a series that now comprises more than 100 titles. Thus began a productive association that was to continue throughout the rest of Foreman's life. Although he followed Indian removal with many other scholarly books, Foreman always regarded it as his most important work. In 1952, the year before he died, he wrote in the foreword to the second printing, "Although I have been engaged in historical research concerning these Indians ever since Indian removal was originally published, I have discovered nothing that would substantially alter the picture presented in the first edition. It has been a pleasure to the writer to note the ever-increasing interest in the history of our Oklahoma Indians, not only among the natives but also among white people who now occupy much of the land formerly owned by these red men. The knowledge thus gained by the whites has made for a more sympathetic understanding of the Indian question." Thus after 20 years Foreman saw some good emerging from his presentation of their story. But among the skeletons on our national conscience, surely none is more difficult for us to closet than our treatment of the American Indians. And one chapter in that story, the account of their dispossession and removal, remains most difficult for us to countenance, even today. Generations of children were brought up on history books that explained our country's development in terms of heroic exploration and expansion, of glorious military conquest, of wresting virgin country from savages, of subduing and taming the wild. The eviction of the Indians, if covered at all, was told briefly in terms of inevitability in the course of advancing civilization. We could face the issue of slavery, fight a civil war to settle it, and satisfy ourselves with the outcome and account of it. But the issue of Indian removal slept in a remote corner of our conscience until it was brought out into the light of historical awareness by Oklahoma historians. And although studies have been made and will continue to be made of the ramifications of the government policy, this volume by Grant Foreman will always remain the definitive account of the actual happenings for these tribes. It is not an impassioned, emotional story, as he has told it, but an account in factual terms of what we did and how we did it, not to a band of nomadic savages, but to settled people, who had complex bait institutions when first seen by white men, and who at the time of their expulsion from their native homelands were developing constitutional governments, establishing schools and churches, and farming by American frontier standards. He lets the documents tell the story, rarely revealing his compassion for the victims or his anger at their exploiters, but the cumulative effect is deeply moving. Finally, in his last 2 paragraphs and in his preface, he rises to eloquence in his evaluation of the whole tragic episode. Here one can understand why, to the end of his life, he always placed this book at the top of his long list. Contents: Book 1/Choctaw Removal. 1/The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. 2/Indians Explore the Western Country. 3/Choctaw Emigration Begins. 4/Suffering of the Emigrants. 5/Emigration Resumed in 1832. 6/Experiences on the March. 7/Condition of the Immigrants. Books 2/Creek Removal. 8/Efforts to remove Creek Indians from Alabama. 9/An Emigrating Party in 1834. 10/Frauds on the Creek Indians. 11/The Creek War of 1836. 12/Wholesale Removal of the Creeks by Force. 13/A Journal of Events. 14/Creek Suffering Removal Completed. Book 2 Re/Chickasaw Removal. 15/The Chickasaw Treaty of Pontotoc. 16/Migration of the Chickasaw Indians. 17/Chickasaw Settlements in the West. Book 4/Cherokee Removal. 18/Oppression of the Cherokee Indians. 19/Cherokee Indians Defend Their Tribal Existence. 20/A Tragic Migration. 21/The Schermerhorn Treaty. Last Stand of the Cherokee. 22/ March of the Broken Spirited. 23/ A Captive Nation. 24/ The Trail of Tears. Book 5/ Seminole Removal. 25/ The Seminole Indians. 26/ The Second Seminole War. 27/ The Fate of Halat-e-Mathla. 28/hunting the Seminole Indians out of the swamps. 29/ the capture of Osceola. 30/Seminole captives deported. 31/ the surrender of Pascofa. Bibliography Index. Preface. Migration of white settlers in the early part of the 19th century into the territory now forming the central and southern states, found the country occupied by tribes of American Indians who had lived there from time immemorial. Tentative legislation was enacted by Congress from time to time, and so-called treaties made with little comprehending Indians were used as instruments to drive them west and still farther west. How these things were done, the inevitable bloodshed and reprisals growing out of this conflict between the races, have been told many times and need no repetition here. Indian removal, operated for some years in a haphazard manner, became established as a national policy with the election as president of its most powerful exponent, Gen. Andrew Jackson. From the lakes to the Gulf the movement took form. Agents and commissions scattered through the country with reams of paper, quills, and ink with which to bind the red man. Indians were called into councils and gorged with pork and beef and plied with whiskey. Chiefs, warriors, and other influential men of the tribes by argument, persuasion, cajolery, threats, or bribes, the means depending on the exigencies of the occasion, were induced to agree to terms set down on paper called treaties. Indian removal by the government was thus formally inaugurated. This book is the account of the removal of the Southern Indians. In the North, weaker and more primitive tribes yielded with comparatively small resistance to the power and chicane of the white man. A different situation in the Southern states called into requisition different methods and resulted in a more complicated story. At least 4 of the tribes of Southern Indians had so far advanced in learning and culture as to establish themselves permanently on the soil, build homes and farms, cultivate the land, raise herds and varied crops, including cotton which they carded, spun, and wove into cloth with which they clothed themselves. They laid out roads, built mills, engaged in commerce, and sent their children to schools conducted by the missionaries. And finally they established representative governments modeled on those of the states. Naturally, a people of such achievements, aware of their rights under prior possession and treaty guarantees with the national government, stubbornly resisted the aggressions of the whites. The forcible uprooting and expulsion of 60,000 such people over a period of more than a decade, developed a story without parallel in the history of this country and resulted in a vast accumulation of manuscript material from which this account is mainly written. It is not intended here to indict the people of the South for mistreatment of the Indians. Whatever may be charged against the white people in this regard is not sectional. The Indians have suffered at their hands throughout the country from north to south and from east to west. The author has undertaken here merely a candid account of the removal of these Southern Indians, so that the reader may have a picture of that interesting and tragic enterprise as revealed by an uncoloured day-by-day recital of events. Nor has he attempted an interpretation of these events or of the actions and motives of the people connected with them. In the removal of these Indians, the magnitude of the undertaking was not comprehended, and the tremendous responsibility for the lives and comfort of the men, women, and children was never appreciated by Congress and the administration. Embarked on a novel enterprise, lack of experience should have requisitioned extraordinary ability and concern for the helpless objects of their decrees, which they were denied. Inadequate preparation by the government and the appointment of a horde of political incompetents to posts of authority, resulted in woeful mismanagement and cruel and unnecessary suffering by the emigrants. Much suffering, perhaps, was inevitable, but much would have been prevented by considerate and skillful preparation. A conspicuous saving grace of this sorrowful story is the fidelity and skill with which the regular army officers and soldiers in the field discharged their unwelcome duties in connection with the removal. In nearly all instances they devoted themselves indefatigably and sympathetically to the sad task of removing the Indians with as much expedition and comfort as possible within the provisions made by their superiors in Washington. In this they contrasted sharply with the volunteer soldiers and a large class of political, civilian employees and especially those of local attachments and prejudices, and the contractors whose purpose was to realize as much profit as possible from their contracts, thereby excluding considerations of comfort for the emigrants. Thousands of tragedies and experiences of absorbing interest marked this, one of the most dramatic chapters in our history, but there were no chroniclers at hand to record them. Only occasionally did the tragedy and pathos of some phase of this undertaking beguile a sympathetic officers to turn from routine and add a line or a paragraph, a stroke that might have been the beginning of a picture of this unhappy migration, but the finished canvas will never be seen by man, it can only be imagined. Little more than a suggestion of the realities is possible from the thousands of manuscripts that have contributed to this account. While this book is not written to excite sympathy for the Indians, this tragic phase of American history is best understood if one will remember that for the most part the Southern Indians were people of fixed habits and tastes. They were not nomads like some Western Indians, they were less inclined to wander to strange places than white people. They loved their streams and valleys, their hills and forests, their fields and herds, their homes and firesides, families and friends. They were rooted in the soil, as the Choctaw chief Pushmataha said, where we have grown up as the herbs of the woods. More than white people, they cherished a passionate attachment for the earth that held the bones of their ancestors and relatives. Few white people either understood or respected this sentiment. The trees that shaded their homes, the cooling spring that ministered to every family, friendly watercourses, familiar trails and prospects, busk grounds, and council houses were their property and their friends. These simple possessions filled their lives. Their loss was cataclysmic. It is doubtful if white people with their readier adaptability can understand the sense of grief and desolation that overwhelmed the Indians when they were compelled to leave all these behind forever and begin the long sad journey toward the setting sun, which they called the Trail of Tears. Book 1/Choctaw Removal. Peter P. Pitchlynn, from a painting by George Catlin, 1834. Smithsonian Institution. Chapter 1/The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. 8. The area of white population east of the Mississippi River expanded, intrusion into the regions occupied or hunted over by the Indians increased, and there was heard with greater frequency the demand that the government extinguish the Indian title to these lands. Numerous effective treaties to this end had been made with the Indians in the northern states, but in the south the stubborn resistance of the more permanent Indian residents blocked general removal of the tribes. Repeatedly had the whites attempted to invoke to their aid the terms of the Georgia Compact of 1802, wherein the federal government had agreed to extinguish at its own expense the Indian title within the reserved limits of Georgia as soon as it could be done peaceably and on reasonable terms. However, some progress had been made. A number of so-called treaties had been negotiated, nominally with the Euro tribes, but usually by the well-established policy of appealing to the avarice of their corruptible chiefs. By these methods tracts of the Indian domain were cut off here and there, so that the whites, by consolidating their gains and moving up again on the Indians, would improve their position for demanding more. Since the Louisiana Purchase, no less than 9 treaties had been made with the Cherokee Indians, by which they had been induced to release parts of their territory or agree to new boundary lines demanded by the whites, 6 with the Creeks, 4 with the Choctaw, 3 with the Chickasaw, and 1 with the Seminole. Events that followed each other in rapid succession were forcing the Indian situation to a crisis. 1 American Historical Association, Annual Report for 1906, I. 235, The History of Events Resulting in Indian Consolidation West of the Mississippi River, by Anna H. Abel. I-19. A development due largely to the aggressiveness and bitter hostility of the state of Georgia. To please the white people of the state and his cousin Governor Trupp, Creek Chief William M. C. Ellentosh signed a treaty relinquishing the lands of the tribe, in violation of tribal law, for which he was executed by his tribesmen in accordance with those laws. This roused the governor to fury, and gave fresh impetus to the efforts of the state to drive out the Indians. Then there occurred the death of Pathkiller, the chief of the Cherokee tribe, and delegates met on July 4, 1827, to elect a successor. Conscious of their advancement as shown by their possession of an alphabet, churches, schools, and laws, they sought a means of ensuring stability and permanence in their home. They found it, they believed, in the adoption of a constitution modeled on that of the United States, which inaugurated a new era of Cherokee history. This threat of permanence stirred the state of Georgia to renewed efforts to drive the Indians from within her borders. She countered by enacting measures extending her criminal laws over the Indians within the state. Similar measures were adopted by the state of Mississippi in January 1830, over the Choctaw and Chickasaw, and by Alabama over the Creeks. The Indians sent delegations and memorials to Washington, pleading for federal intervention to protect them in their treaty rights against the states. The federal government was induced to send emissaries to the Indians, and by approaching them publicly and privately to attempt to break down their resistance against removing West. By the time Andrew Jackson became a candidate for president in 1828, the subject of Indian removal had become a national issue. Jackson's attitude as a strong partisan of the states that desired removal was well known. He had appeared in the negotiations to procure many of the Indian treaties of cession. His dominating personality impressed the Indians, and he beguiled many into the conviction that he was their friend, so that with the tremendous influence which he exercised over them, he became the outstanding exponent of the white man's relentless contest for the lands of the Indian. Logically, one of the first important measures to be urged by Jackson after his election was what became known as the Indian Removal Bill. Missionary organizations and other influences in the North had been favorable to general removal west of all the tribes, as the means best calculated to protect the Indians, but when it developed that the people of Georgia were interested only in driving the Indians from their state, active opposition of most of the North was aligned against the measure. After one of the bitterest debates in the history of Congress, this bill was enacted into law on May 28, 1830. It did not itself authorize the enforced removal of the Indians, and did not in terms appear to menace them, but it announced a federal policy favorable to Indian removal, and placed in the hands of President Jackson the means to initiate steps to secure exchanges of lands with any tribe residing within the limits of the states or otherwise. Knowing Jackson's views on the subject and the federal policy employed in dealing with the Indians, they were filled with foreboding. President Jackson lost no time in taking steps to carry the new law into effect. At the adjournment of Congress, he and John H. Eaton, his Secretary of War, planned to spend their holidays in Tennessee, and 4 days after the law was enacted they sent word by D.W. Haley that they would confer with delegates from the 4 tribes, who were favorable to removal. The President, Secretary Eaton, and John Coffee arrived at Eaton's home in Franklin on August 11. Because of the strife between the factions of the Choctaw Nation, it was impossible to convene a meeting at which a representative and authorized delegation from that tribe could be selected to meet the President. Therefore, only the Chickasaw delegates appeared. And after making a provisional treaty with them, Eaton and Coffee went to Mississippi to confer with the Choctaw Indians. Some progress toward preparation had already been made in this nation, in a measure through the agency of Greenwood Leffler, a shrewd half-breed member of the tribe. As chief of one of the 3 districts into which the Choctaw Nation was divided, he exerted considerable influence. He was intelligent and ambitious, and was quick to realize the import of events and their bearing on his personal fortunes, if indeed, he did not rely on explicit promises made to him for his assistance. In March he called a meeting of some of the head men of the tribe friendly to him, who undertook ambitious and radical enterprises under his direction. He told them that in the face of the crisis confronting them, they must change the form of their government and in place of 3 chiefs must unite on one. As part of this plan, on the 2nd day of the council, David Folsom, the rival of Mushulatub for chieftainship in the northeastern district, and John Garland, claiming against Nitakechi the same office in the southern district, resigned in the council such tenure as they held. They then voted to make Leffler chief of the whole nation. In the afternoon of that day, the 16th, Leffler assumed the role of chief of the tribe and addressed the council on the subject of the difficulties that confronted them and the necessity for immediate decision as to their future course. After extended discussion, the council voted in favor of emigration. The next day a treaty prepared in the handwriting of Alexander Talley, a missionary in the service of Leffler, was signed by the chiefs and 200 or 300 warriors present. This document, for certain considerations, purported in the name of the tribe to give up their lands in Mississippi and agree to remove to the west. It was then delivered to Major Haley, the president's envoy, whose presence at the time explains much that took place there. Haley carried it to Washington, and it was soon followed by a protest from chiefs and leading men who were not in sympathy with the ambitious Leffler. When both documents were submitted to the Senate, the treaty was rejected, and the subject was held in abeyance until commissioners appointed for the purpose could meet representatives of the whole tribe. Leffler's conception of a government headed by one chief had much to recommend it, but he was not popular outside 6F his own district, particularly with the full-bloods, and the tribe as a whole was opposed to him as chief. The so-called election came to nothing in spite of the arguments and threats he wasted on Mushulatub, Nitakechi, and their followers. In FAC, this attempted change, which probably had the sanction of the administration at Washington, increased the jealousy and bitter feeling already existing between the chiefs and factions of the tribe and did more harm than good degree. Leffler at first took a bold stand, and in April wrote to Mushulatub an arrogant letter which he signed as chief of Choctaw Nation, warning the full-blood chief that he must abdicate as district chief and conform to the views of the writer, or take the consequences. Shortly after, Mushulatub and Nitakechi appealed to Agent Ward to prevent a threatened invasion of their districts by an army of 1,000 men under Leffler and Folsom. Bad feeling and excitement grew until, on July 14, a serious disturbance took place, where the Indians were gathered to hold a large council and to receive their annuity, at the factory in the Choctaw Nation, on the Tombigbee River, 15 miles from Erie. The difference existing between Pekushulatup and Leffler has existed for some time, which arose in the first place, from a disposition held forth by Leffler, had encamped a short distance from the factory. The agents were distributing to each his portion, with as little delay as possible, to let them depart to their homes. Information was received, that Leffler, with a party of about 1,500 warriors had arrived. Between 800 and 900 of his men were armed, 500 had muskets, and many of those who had not guns, had prepared themselves with war clubs, spears, knives, etc. In the meantime Leffler had sent a messenger to Kushulatub informing him, that if he did not consent to give up his commission, that he would fall upon him, and would not desist while he retained life. 2 hours were given for his decision. To this message Kushulatub paid the utmost contempt. 2 or 3 messages of the same import, at different times, were given to and to all of which he gave answers of utter disdain, and defiance. His men were all anxious for a contest. Leffler's warriors were all painted, and expressed much anxiety to fight. This may be considered as an outrage, as Leffler must have come at least 200 miles for the purpose of chastising Ushulatub, for his unbelief. Folsom had carried the ultimatum from Leffler to Mushulatub, and the latter replied in writing that he would never acknowledge as chiefs either Leffler or Folsom, let the consequences be what they might. That evening the hostile party came down to the house where we were and marched up in platoons to the old Tutingo, who was in the middle of the yard within 6 paces, and halted until all was formed. When the cowardly commander was told they were without arms but name the day and place and they should have a fight to his satisfaction, his reply was that he did not want to fight, only to restore peace, and that he had nothing against him, the chief Netakeji, etc., etc. So he went away with his party and reported they made Pekushulatup run, which was false to my own knowledge. A greater tyrant and coward I never have seen than this man Flower. He has now found that the Indians will not have him as king for life over them, and he wants an excuse not only for his attempts upon their rights but is the first to oppose any treaty. General Jackson has sent on Dr. Donnelly to try and get them to meet the Seki of war at Franklin 10. And we are doing our best, but Flower will oppose everything unless he can get all his Everest heart is set on. Asterisk. Mushulatub and Nitakechi and their full-blood following had thwarted Loeffler's ambitious plan to present himself as the head chief of the Choctaw Nation in the forthcoming negotiations with the commissioners for the surrender of their lands in Mississippi. But he had exerted himself industriously and with some effect with the people of the tribe to facilitate those negotiations. Eaton and Coffee arrived at Dancing Rabbit Creek in the Choctaw Nation September 15 and began discussions with the head men of the tribe. The commissioners told the Indians that the government was unable to prevent the laws of the state of Mississippi from operating on them contrary to their rights guaranteed by federal treaties, that if they undertook to resist those laws, 10 or 100 times as many armed white men would compel them to submit, and warned them that their best interests required their removal to the west. After providing for the issuance of rations to the Indians in attendance and other preliminaries, the council began on the 18th registered. With Peter P. Pitchlynn as chairman of the Choctaw participants and his father John Pitchlynn as interpreter. A bitter controversy arose over the contention of Loeffler and his partisans that his district should have a larger representation in the council than the others, and it required much time, tact, and patience on the part of the commissioners to establish peace between the participants so that negotiations could proceed. For nearly 2 weeks the Indians in the council were obdurate, and finally after agreeing that they would not sign a treaty, many of them left for home. Then John Pitchlynn made a suggestion that won over the remaining Indians on the grounds, and dissuaded them from their threats to mob the chiefs and head men if they should sign the treaty. George S. Gaines of Demopolis was a merchant who had dealt honestly with the Indians and held their confidence and respect for his character and ability. The plan proposed by Pitchlynn and adopted by General Eaton was to promise the Indians that Mr. Gaines would be asked to conduct a party of them to examine the western country. If they found it satisfactory they were to remove and Gaines would be entrusted with the management of the removal, for the Indians said they knew that Gaines would not drive them through the mud like animals. Upon the request of Eaton, therefore, Gaines agreed to discharge the undertaking proposed, and the delegation of explorers was decided upon, which with the other inducements employed, resulted in securing the execution of the treaty by the Indians on September 27. The other means employed are obvious. The 3 chiefs of the 3 districts, who signed the treaty, Greenwood, Loeffler, Nitakechi, and Mushulatub, registered were each given 4 sections of land by the treaty. More than 50 other favored members of the tribe put forward by the chiefs, were given from 1 to 2 sections each for no apparent reason other than to win their approval and influence and remove their opposition. Medals and gratuities were passed about. David Folsom, besides receiving 4 sections of land, was later allowed $100 for the expense of each of his 2 sons at La Grange Academy in Georgia, and Greenwood Loeffler was given $100 to send his daughter to the female academy at the same place. 1 Registered this, the first treaty to be made and ratified under the AC of May 28, 1830, was known as the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. The preamble of the treaty recited that whereas the General Assembly of the State of Mississippi has extended the laws of said state to persons and property within the chartered limits of the same, and the President of the United States has said that he cannot protect the Choctaw people from the operation of these laws. By the terms of this treaty the Choctaw ceded to the United States the entire country owned by them east of the Mississippi River and agreed to remove on the domain within the Indian Territory which the government promised to convey to them in fee simple. The Indians were given 3 years to emigrate. The treaty was not ratified and proclaimed until February 24, 1831. On May 26, the President proclaimed his grant conveying to the Choctaw Indians the lands described in the treaty, with boundaries, beginning near Fort Smith where the Arkansas boundary crosses the Arkansas River, running thence to the source of the Canadian Fork, if in the limits of the United States, or to those limits, thence due south to Red River, and down Red River to the west boundary of the territory of Arkansas, thence, north along that line, to the beginning. Registered there was much resentment against the treaty, as a majority of the tribe was opposed to it. Meetings were held where the Indians conferred on plans to memorialize the President and Senate to reject the treaty degree, but for want of leadership and ability to organize themselves this agitation came to nothing. Most of the leaders of the tribe had been aligned securely by bribery with the government and the treaty, but efforts were made to break or remove from office the chiefs who signed the treaty. The attitude of the politicians in the tribe does not make a pretty picture. Familiar with the government's policy of bribing those in position to appear and bind the tribe, the desire to share in this largesse is too apparent in their jealousies and contentions for official preferment at the time a treaty was to be negotiated and large sums of money expended in executing it. In the northeastern or Mushulatubs district, the partisans of David Folsom met and declared the latter chief of the district. His brother Israel Folsom and John Garland went into Nitacakis, or southern, district, and by circulating among the Indians the charge that their chief had accepted money for signing the treaty, got warriors of 6 towns, Hajawaney and Chickasaw trademark towns to meet in council and declare Joel Arnall their chief. In Greenwood Leffler's district, the western, the disaffected ones met on October 23 on Chufocto Creek and elected as Chief George W. Harkins II*, who was then in the west. Harkins was the son-in-law of David Folsom and the nephew of Leffler. However, the government refused to recognize as chiefs any but those who had signed the treaty. Meetings were held in a number of places where resolutions denouncing Leffler for his tyrannical conduct were signed by a large number of Indians and forwarded to the War Department. Chapter 2/Indians explore the Western country. 8 Soon as the treaty was signed, long even before its ratification, white people began removing into the Choctaw country in violation of the laws by which the land was secured to the Indians. Confusion reigned in the nation during the fall and winter of 1830 pending determination of the question whether the treaty would be ratified by the Senate. The tribe was torn by dissension, crops had been bad and some wished to go at once to the west, others preferred to stay and be incorporated into the state. Jealousy existed among the leaders of the tribe. They distrusted each other, everybody was under suspicion. While numbers were leaving and traveling independently of the government to their new home in the West, others refused to go, and rallied around leaders of like inclination. Immediately after the execution of the treaty, arrangements were made for sending west the exploring parties of Chickasaw and Choctaw. Pursuant to the agreement made with General Eaton, George S. Gaines closed out his business in order to finance and conduct the expedition and made his preparations to depart with the company of Choctaw explorers composed of the chiefs of the 3 districts, each accompanied by 4 of his principal men. Prior to their departure, an independent exploring party conducted by George W. Harkins and Robert Folsom, a brother of David Folsom, set out for the western country and, returning the early part of December, made a favorable report on their new home on Red River. They crossed the Choctaw line at the salt works and later found good land enough on Little River to hold several thousand families. The second stream we come to was rivals for chieftainship in their district arrived at Vicksburg with their combined parties amounting to 1,950 emigrants who expect to start for their new country in the morning, but if they get away in 5 days they will do well. George Harkins came in last evening with a party of 500 more. All is confusion and uproar. They have taken their annuity for this year, much pulling and hauling, swearing and drinking. The Indians are in a great hurry to spend the little money they have, and the whites are quarreling for the privilege of cheating them. For the steamboat Walter Scott, 200 tons, left Vicksburg the latter part of November with Colonel Gaines and about 1,000 emigrants under the leadership of Nitacakis, who were landed at Arkansas Post to await with many others, boats that could ascend the Arkansas River. In January 1832, 1,000 of them in charge of Wharton Rector were embarked on the steamboat Reindeer and a 170-ton keel boat in tow, and disembarked at Little Rock January 16. The Reindeer immediately returned to Arkansas Post to bring up Mushulatub's party registered. The encampment of Nitacakis people 3 miles south of Little Rock was called Camp Pope. Here they awaited the arrival of their wagons from Arkansas Post. 400 more of this party in charge of Colonel Childress came overland from the post with between 200 and 300 horses and on January 22 joined the remainder of the emigrants at Camp Pope registered. This party in charge of Robert M. Jones, a Choctaw, had left Vicksburg with between 400 and 500 horses belonging to the emigrants to be brought through the Mississippi swamp to Arkansas Post, and there join the main body of emigrants. On the journey of nearly 40 days through the swamp, more than 200 of the horses died of starvation and exhaustion, which is not surprising in view of the fact that Jones was provided with only $100 to purchase forage for the horses and subsistence for the accompanying Indians. Major F.W. Armstrong, the newly appointed agent to the Choctaw, came to Little Rock registered January 22, and shortly afterward a boat arrived bringing up a quantity of rifles, ammunition, hoes, and axes intended for the Indians, some of which Armstrong issued to Nitakakee's party of 1,400 at Little Rock. On the 25th of the month, 1,300 of this party, under the direction of Warden Rector, broke camp and left Little Rock with 50 wagons over the almost impassable road traveled by Folsom's party a month before, to Washington and the Red River. 200 more emigrants, who from the lack of wagons were unable to leave with the remainder of the party, followed on February 5 under the escort of S.M. Rutherford, who was instructed to pick up stragglers. This party included Nitakache and his family, who were quite ill. While the other boats at Vicksburg were loading for the Arkansas River, 564 emigrants with their effects led by Joel H. Nail of Nitakakee's district were embarked on the Talma 8 140 tons, in charge of St. Cross's special agent, and 600 on the, and hundreds of gallons leave here almost daily for the Indian nations, the merchants making the Indian an agent for his illicit trade. A letter from Rains of June 10 reveals the government trying to compel the Indians to eat meat sent down from Fort Gibson because it was spoiled and unfit for consumption by the soldiers. 78 barrels had been condemned at the post and turned over to Lieutenant Rains. Another lot of 100 barrels had not been officially condemned, but as it had been stored at Fort Gibson for 4 or 5 years, officials took advantage of the supposed opportunity to salvage it by giving it to the Indians. However, the latter refused to accept it, and Rains found himself in difficulties, as he was charged with 178 barrels of pork. But, after having it scraped and rebrinned, he wrote in December, "I have issued some barrels of it, and am in hopes of issuing more." 48. Preliminary to resumption of the removal in 1832, it was determined to construct a road from Fort Smith to the Choctaw settlements on the Red River. The great raft in that stream made navigation uncertain if not impossible. Freight was carried from Natchitoches to Fort Towson at a cost of $5 or $6 a barrel, and required a passage of at least 50 days. To reduce this excessive freight charge and find a better route, it was determined to carry supplies and provisions intended for those Indians up the Arkansas River to Fort Smith, and take them overland from there. It was planned to make this new road part of the mail route to Washington, by which mail was carried through from Fort Smith, through Missouri by or near Jackson, crossing the upper Mississippi near Cape Girardeau, then passing to Golconda, and then crossing the Ohio. Fort Towson had been re-established in 1831 for the protection of the emigrating Indians and the frontier, despite the stubborn resistance of Greenwood Leffler, who had taken possession of the location when the buildings were burned and insisted on holding it. 4 companies of the 3rd Infantry under Major S.W. Kearny occupied the site of the old post in the summer of 1831, and called it Camp Phoenix. As the work progressed, it was later given the old name of Cantonment Towson, and then Fort Towson. The re-establishment of the post created further demands for a road over the mountainous country intervening between it and the Arkansas River. In 1831, the citizens and Indians on the Red River were clamoring for the government to construct a road, and in the autumn the Secretary of War authorized Major Armstrong to call on the commanding officer at Fort Gibson to furnish troops to build it. Registered after a route had been surveyed by Robert Bean and Jesse Chisholm, the road measuring 147 miles to Horse Prairie was constructed in 3 months by a force of men under Capt. John Stewart. The work was menaced at times by hostile prairie Indians, and it was necessary for the troops to carry their arms ready for use on a gun rack mounted on a sled that was kept at the front of their work. At one stage they met a party of Choctaw Indians traveling in great haste who said they had been run in by a band of Pawnee Indians who were in considerable force on the west side of Boggy River. Lieutenant Rains, dispersing agent for the Choctaw immigrants at Fort Smith, in January 1832, had 33 wagons, ox teams, and teamsters to transfer over this new road the guns, plows, and other property and supplies provided for the Indians on the Red River by the late treaty. Registered 6 oxen were driven to each wagon, and though they were engaged for several months, they made but one trip to the Red River during the year. With the arrival of warm weather, the flies became so bad it was impossible to make more. In the spring of 1832 owing to the law of the state of Mississippi passed at the last session, granting permission to the whites to settle in the Nov. 15. Left camp early in the morning, traveled 10 miles, the road being bad in the prairie, encamped at night at Ogre. This morning the 2 U.S. teams came up and took in the sick, at least a part, 1 death reported. The next day they encamped in the big prairie and issued rations and forage for 2 days. Rain fell all that night and another emigrant died on the 17th. The next day they traveled in the rain and 2 more deaths occurred before the wet, cold, and miserable emigrants reached the Arkansas River. They spent the 19th and 20th crossing the river and traveled 3 miles before they encamped to wait for some of the Indians who stopped at Little Rock to have their wagons repaired. During the next week they advanced about 70 miles on their way and crossed Caddo River. Sickness and deaths from cholera were increasing and 13 wagons were filled with the sick Indians and baggage. Day after day the routine was much the same. Camp was made in the afternoon to issue rations and give the Indians scattered along the road time to catch up, or the conductor sent men back to help them along so the whole party would be present for an early start on the morrow. The emigrants entered the Choctaw country December 8. They traveled 18 miles, encamped at McCann's, drew forage and provisions for 2 days. The next day some of the emigrants dropped out and decided to settle near. The remainder traveled 13 miles, and on the 10th after they resumed their march they were cheered by the sight of 300 of their friends, former arrivals, who came to welcome them and marched with them to Clear Creek. The next day the emigrants continued to the vicinity of Fort Towson where their journey ended and they dispersed to select homes in the surrounding country. Lieutenant Jefferson Van Horn, dispersing agent for the removal, conducted the contingent in charge of horses and cattle that were being taken overland from Vicksburg to meet the main Leffler party on the Fort Towson road. With the cattle and 244 horses of this party and 47 Indians and Negroes he crossed the Mississippi River on the snag boat Heliopolis about 8 miles above Vicksburg on November 2 and 3, 1832. The main party proceeded up the river by steamboat as Van Horn and his party traveled overland through the swamps, for a few days paralleling the course of the boat. Though it rained the first 3 days, they made progress up the river and by the 6th they were 56 miles from the river crossing, then dayed 12 miles, over a very deep and bad swamp where many of the ponies were mired and we had to pull them out. 1 or 2 that were unable to get along, were knocked in the head by their owners. When we arrived at Bayou Plaquin I called for some time for the ferryman. At length, a drunken old hack bellowed from the cabin on the opposite side, that there was no man about, and I must wait until he should come. Upon this, I commenced crossing the horses. We drove in about 20. They swam over, and every one mired on the opposite shore. I induced an Indian to swim over and bring the raft. About a dozen of us crossed and with some difficulty, pulled all the horses out. I now crossed all the people and baggage on the raft, and drove the remainder of the horses in lower down where they crossed without difficulty. They had trouble in keeping the horses together, some of the owners were tardy in arriving in camp with their stock, horses strayed off in the night and the search for them in the morning caused delays. They had reached the house of one Morris, the last in the settlements along the river, and were about to enter the swamps again. Van Horn had been ill and performed his duties with great difficulty. In the evening one of my party called me aside and desired the prescription for cholera. I gave it. As it was very cold, this man and myself slept before the fire, at Plurry's house. The symptoms increased on me until near midnight, when the constant purging and vomiting, and terrible cramps and pain in my stomach and bowels, induced me to take 20 grains of calomel, and a large pill of opium. These I threw up. While vomiting through the floor, and bent double with pain, I was repeating the dose. I was ordered to leave the house. Morris said he had a large family, and that their lives and his own were at stake, that I had imposed on him in coming there in that condition, and that I must quit the house. The ground was already covered with frost, Euro was freezing severely. I rolled myself in my blanket, after begging in vain to remain, and walked 3/4 of a mile to my tent. Van Horn was better the next day, but he continued very weak for some time. The following 2 weeks were uneventful, the party making from 10 to 20 miles daily in the rains over bad roads through the swamps. They broke camp and started each day at 7 to 10 o'clock or as soon as their horses could be collected, and made camp at 3 or 4 in the afternoon when they could find a comparatively dry place where there were wood, water, and cane for their stock. One day as they were traveling along, a horse was killed by a falling tree. November 23, Van Horn's party intersected the road to Fort Towson traveled by Leffler's party. The road was crowded with emigrating Choctaws. Some of my party, anxious to join their wives and relatives, hastened on and united with them in the evening. Others joined next day. A party of 1,800 Choctaw Indians from Nitakakees district were approaching Little Rock from Rock Row, and Van Horn was directed to report to Major Armstrong at the former place for service in connection with these emigrants. At sunrise on the morning of the 29th I commenced crossing the party of 6 towns, assigned to me, consisting of 629 people, with 14 hired teams and 9 native teams. I counted the people as they crossed the Arkansas. We encamped about 4:30 o'clock, 4 miles from Little Rock, convenient to good water and wood. 30th. Proceeded at 7:30 o'clock, over a good road to the stand on Hurricane. December 1st. Started at 8 o'clock, and proceeded leisurely over a good road, until about 2:30 o'clock. We could easily have done much further, but Lieutenant Montgomery's party was not far ahead and deemed it best to keep a day's journey in rear of them. The party traveled with great cheerfulness and harmony, and were fast improving in health. When I joined the main party east of Little Rock, great numbers were sick, and considerable numbers dying. And it rained powerfully last night. Started at 8 o'clock. Issued 2 days' supplies for the 3rd and 4th. 6 people and 24 horses joined from the horse party. I rejected a quantity of beef presented at the stand. It had been slaughtered too long, and had spoiled. Other beef was furnished in its place. Encamped at 3:30 o'clock, convenient to wood and water. 3 RD. Started at 8 o'clock. I gave a certificate for crossing 584 of my people at the ferry over Washita River. 65 of David Folsom's people, who had fallen back from Lieutenant Phillips' party, being unable to get over, requested me to cross them. I did so. All the teams and horses of my party forded, but the river was too deep and swift for the people to do so. A man in the employ of David the ferryman made several of my party drunk, notwithstanding I went into his shop before my party came up, and obtained his pledge that they should not have any liquor. Some of Lieutenant Phillips' party whom I found here had been beastly drunk for many days. We encamped about 40° clock on the bank of a beautiful creek. 8th. Started about 8 o'clock. 1 berth since last issue. Issued to 634 people. Encamped about 4 o'clock on a fine stream. Sth. All the captains called on me in a body and desired me to wait until the cart of their head man at Oklahoma should be brought up. I had sent back more than once, and had much trouble to get this old man and his cart along. His oxen were poor and worn out, and his cart badly constructed. but he was looked to and beloved by the whole party. He would not part with his cart, and although it might have been policy to go on and leave the wretched old establishment, I found it impossible to get his people along without him. He was old, lame, and capped ears, and gave me more trouble than all the rest of the party. Proceeded at 9:30 o'clock, and crossed the Fernois. As the weather was cold and the water deep and swift, the teams, horses and young men forded, and the women, children, and old men crossed in the boat. At Otahoma's cart was brought up repaired. Encamped about 4 o'clock. Off. Rained all last night, and the whole day severely. Found it difficult to start the party at 9 o'clock. At Otahoma's cart fell to the rear again. I sent back Mr. Ryan and the interpreter with a yoke of oxen and driver to bring it up. Encamped about 4 o'clock. The rain continued in the night. 8th. Started at 8 o'clock. The Little Missouri River had risen considerably, but I managed to get the teams and horses through it. I crossed the people in the boat, counting only grown persons. I gave a certificate for the passage of 340. The road was quite muddy this day. We encamped at the stand at 3:30 o'clock and 2 days of provisions copyright forage were issued. Off. Notwithstanding I had hired a yoke of oxen and driver to bring Ed Otahoma's cart with the party, he failed to bring it farther than Little Missouri River. Alany of Ed Otahoma's people had stopped behind, and this morning all the captains called on me and requested that the party might lay to this day to allow all to get up with the party, and that they might wash, mend their moccasins and rest. They said Ed Otahoma was their chief, that they all loved him, that he old and lame, and that they were unwilling to go on and leave him behind. I remained, made a new axle tree for his cart, brought it up with a fresh yoke of oxen, and to prevent any more trouble, hauled his cart with this yoke of oxen all the remainder of the journey. 5 people with 5 horses came to me here, stating that they had quit Lieutenant Phillips' party to hunt their horses which had strayed. As they were known to my interpreter, I took them on with my party. Registered. The journal for the following week contains little of interest. The party camped at Washington, Arkansas, on the 10th and reached Little River on the 14th. Van Horn began crossing his party at daybreak the next morning, but some who were late in arriving at the river were not crossed until dark. 2 days later they arrived at the stand established by David Folsom. Here provisions for 2 days were issued to the emigrants, who proceeded 12 miles farther, and encamped on a beautiful spot, convenient to excellent water and wood. 18th. Started at 8 o'clock. For the last few days we had been met by many brother of Nitakechi, who on his departure for the west had left his brother in command as second chief, and the other by his rival Joel Nail. They were strung along the road for a great distance, men, women, and children, mounted on their ponies, or riding in their ox carts, but most of the men traveled on foot. The Indians' wagons, those hired by the government, and the ponies were loaded to their capacity with an odd assortment of personal belongings of the Indians, loved possessions with which they planned to start life anew in a strange country. Ahead was a large number of cattle to furnish them fresh meat every other day. The countryside witnessed the astonishing spectacle presented by this caravan, whence came the hallooing of the drovers herding the cattle along the route, the creaking and rattle of ox carts, the commands of the ox drivers and the cracks of their whips, the imprecations of teamsters to horses struggling to pull the wagons through the mud, the bawling of cattle and the whinnying of horses. After this little army had passed, there were left only the patterns of thousands of hoof and footprints in the mud and a strange silence. These aborigines had departed forever from the land that for ages had been home to them and their ancestors. On the 17th they traveled 7 miles over roads so bad they found it necessary to hire more wagons to lighten their loads. The next day they were compelled to build a bridge, and passed through a swamp where they were in places obliged to hitch 12 oxen to a wagon. However, they made 5 miles by night and had 1,775 Indians enrolled. According to the journal kept by Calhoun, registered on the 19th, left our encampment early. The oxen on one of the foremost wagons turned off a bridge to drink and capsized the wagon, causing a detention of 2 hours. Another wagon broke, came to at rab trees and issued beef. Detained by 2 are every day more and more embarrassed by debts, many of which debts will, I fear, be antedated, and, made by chiefs who are interested, to assume the character of claims against the nation. Registered if the government had kept the treaty pledge that the white intruders would be removed from the Indian land, the situation would not have been so desperate, but the instant their removal was threatened, vociferous protests went up from the Alabamans, and the government supinely desisted. Having induced the Creeks to enter into the much-desired treaty, the government agents gave themselves little concern for the promises made to the Indians. Their outstanding grievance, the presence of white intruders on their lands, the government had particularly bound itself in the treaty to correct. Yet not only was nothing done about it, but the situation was permitted to become much worse. The next month after the treaty was made, the Secretary of War directed Robert L. Crawford, United States Marshal for the Southern District of Alabama, to remove the intruders from the land of the Creeks. The failure to accomplish anything under this order is easily understood from its reading and the qualification that star. It is the President's desire that this be executed with as much regard to the feelings and situation of the persons, whose cases are embraced by it, as possible. As if that did not sufficiently emasculate the order of removal, the Secretary added, "In the execution of this delicate trust, I recommend to you to be as conciliatory as may be compatible with the object to be obtained." And further, to save the feelings of these lawless intruders, Cass added in another paragraph, "Apply force only when absolutely necessary, and then only after having fully explained to the parties their own duties, the rights of the Indians, the obligations of the government, and the instructions you have received." Obviously no adequate results were expected, and of course none followed. In the following September the Creeks called a council at Wetumpka, and on the 27th drafted a memorial to the Secretary of War advising him that instead of our situation being relieved as was anticipated, we are distressed in a tenfold manner. We are surrounded by the whites with their fields and fences, our lives are in jeopardy, we are daily threatened. We are prevented from building new houses, or clearing new fields. We have for the last 6 months lived in fear, yet we have borne it with patience, believing our father, the President, would comply on his part with what he had pledged himself to do. Degree the month before, the government had made a feeble gesture through the United States Marshal, who threatened to remove some intruders and actually did remove a few in Pike County, but as soon as the Marshal had left, the whites returned in force and ran the Indians away from their farms restored to them by the Marshal. They were accompanied by the sheriff of the county who, armed with writs for the Marshal and military officers with him, was prepared to defy the authority of the federal government. Some of these intruders who had been removed by the Marshal brought in the state courts actions of trespass against the Indians reinstated in their homes. A particularly attractive location on the west bank of the Chattahoochee River, about 45 miles below Fort Mitchell, was that occupied by a town of the Eufaula Creeks, known as Ola Eufaula. These Indians were driven off, their houses burned, and in their stead the whites built a small village of log houses which the legislature in 1831 incorporated under the name of Irwinton. The Marshal reported in August that he found 18 intruders on some choice land near this town. They had not only taken the Indians' land from them, and burned and destroyed their houses and corn, but used violence to their persons. The Indians had fled from 40 to 50 miles. Those persons who had been guilty of intrusion were ordered to leave the country. From threats and menaces used by them, I ordered a detachment of troops from Fort Mitchell, for the purpose of facilitating business, and my own security. 24 The members of another little village who were driven from their homes, set out for the Cherokee Nation. After traveling a few miles, they were stopped by a party of white men, who tied up and most inhumanly whipped some of them, and drove the whole party back. After driving them from their homes, the little cornfields of the Indians were raided, and this grain, their staff of life, was carried off by the whites while the Indians suffered from hunger and were even threatened with starvation. Crowell reported that most of the Indians were in the woods without the means of subsistence, hiding from the ferocity of the white intruders. Registered again, the Indians met at Wetumpka December 20, and made another plaintive appeal to the Secretary of War for a compliance with the promise of relief against the intruders. The futile gesture by which the marshal had removed a few intruders had been abandoned, the handful of troops withdrawn, and the whites were hilarious with their victory over the Indians and the federal officers. The Indians said, "We are without friends and surrounded by enemies. Our only alternative is protection from the United States. This is promised in the treaty, we claim it as a right." Enoch Parsons wrote to Cass, January 13, 183,328, that the head chiefs were still opposed to going west. Their influence prevented the common Indians from expressing a favorable opinion on the subject. How the Indians are to subsist the present year, I cannot imagine. Some of them are sustaining themselves upon roots. They have, apparently, very little corn, and scarcely any stock. The game is gone, and what they are to do, God only knows. Nothing can preserve their property, or their existence, other than their immediate removal to the country designed for them. Registered, he proposed to donate to the starving Indians 30 or 40 barrels of spoiled flour at Fort Mitchell. He thought it would save the lives of many, and ameliorate the sufferings of others. The Yuchi people near the town, the women and children in particular, are most needy. Many desperate and unprincipled white men have, since the ratification of the treaty, entered our nation and have taken Indians' wives, with the sole view of enjoying the privileges and securing to themselves the benefit guaranteed to our people in the treaty in the selection and ownership of reserves, wrote the chiefs to the Secretary of War *degree as the white intruders had continued their aggressions with impunity and complaints continued to reach Washington. On March 14, 1833, nearly a year after the Indians had been promised relief, the Office of Indian Affairs at the direction of Mr. Cass, issued instructions to the marshal to put an end to this lawless and disgraceful practice of intrusion. Nothing was done under this order, however, and on June 3 the Secretary himself directed the marshal to order the intruders off and to use the military to enforce his orders. It was exactly a month later that Deputy Marshal Austell reached Fort Mitchell to secure troops to remove the intruders. He reported that there were 3,000 white intruders, and that he would remove only such as the chiefs wished removed. August 26, 1833, Mr. Cass wrote to Crawford, Afr. Austell has requested that instructions may be given to prevent the sale of whiskey upon the though a federal officer. Tarrant was afraid to give advice to the distracted Indians and thus offend the people of Alabama. Near West Point, Austell was having a serious time in July in removing intruders, who were raising volunteers to resist the efforts of the marshal and military. He was compelled to increase his force and threatened to take the intruders as prisoners to Mobile before they would yield. 2 weeks later, Austell reported that the condition of the Indians was most deplorable. Some of the white intruders he had not removed, as they had a large number of claims against the Indians, and threatened the latter that if they were removed they would sue everyone without mercy. And as the agent knew they would be helpless in the state court of Alabama, where they could not be heard to defend themselves, he advised them to submit. Thus did the executive branch of the government decline to keep the promise made to the Indians less than a year before. Crawford, the marshal, protested against temporizing. Among those intruders were some of the most lawless and uncouth men I have ever seen, some of them refugees from the state of Georgia, and for whom rewards are offered. Intimidations continued. The Indians were in such fear of the vengeance of the intruders, and had such little confidence in the promises of the government, that they asked that the former be not removed until their crops were gathered, if they would promise to pay for the use of their farms. Those who were driven off last season, Austell wrote the Secretary of War, had returned. And if they were put out, it would subject the Indians to greater difficulties than they are now in. They have compelled the Indians to give up their farms, and to consent to take rents, and although they are thus compelled into measures, there is no redress, for these people exercise the state laws over them to an alarming extent. The officers of the state have in some cases issued false precepts, and executed them upon the Indians. False accounts are made out, the Indians seized and put in jail, and compelled to surrender all they have, either their land claims or their property. How this species of fraud and villainy is to be obviated I am unable to say, unless the Indians leave the country. Instead of establishing claims upon good feelings, seem rather to expose them to injuries. Their weaknesses receive no compassion, and their very helpless ignorance but renders them more liable to wrongs. We see no remedy to their condition but in emigrating west, and it would be better for them to abandon their lands for nothing and to move, than to remain under their present circumstances. For the feeble efforts of the federal government to keep its promises to the Indians provoked the increased hostility of the white people. A man named Hardyman Owen, who had cruelly beaten the Indians, driven them from their lands and killed their hogs and horses, defied and threatened the marshal. When arrested in July 1833, about 20 miles from Fort Mitchell, he promised to leave and was released. He then went into his house, mined it with gunpowder, invited the marshal in and disappeared through the back door. The marshal was about to enter when he was stopped by the warning of an Indian, and in a few seconds the house was blown up. The soldiers pursued Owen, surrounded him and killed him. When he attempted to shoot one of them, registered the killing of Owen created great excitement, and the governor of Alabama demanded that the federal government withdraw the marshal and commit the Indians to the tender mercies of the state courts for redress of their grievances, also claiming for the white people of the state title to most of the Creek land by virtue of the notoriously larcenous contracts which the Indians had been induced to sign. In September Mr. Cass replied, "Since the ratification of this treaty, repeated representations have been made to this department by the public agents, by respectable individuals, and by the Indians, that gross and wanton outrages have been committed upon the latter, by persons who have intruded upon the ceded lands. It has been stated that the houses of the Indians have been forcibly taken possession of, and sometimes burnt, and the owners driven into the woods, that their fields and improvements have been wrested from them and occupied by white persons, that grave injuries have been committed upon the persons of the Indians, and that their horses, cattle, hogs, and other property, have been forcibly taken from them. The appeals of the chiefs to the government to carry into effect and to afford their people protection, have been repeated and forcible. They represent that their crops have been taken from them, and they look forward to a state of starvation, unless some decisive step is adopted in their favor. And, in addition to all this, the deputy marshal reports that there are 400 persons selling whiskey to the Indians on the ceded lands." In conveying the president's rejection of the proposal, Cass mildly reminded the governor that it would be vain to expect that the protection promised by the federal government could be obtained in the state courts registered. The grand jury of Russell County on October 14 returned indictments against the soldier James Emerson, who was supposed to have shot Owen, charging him with murder, and the other soldiers and the officers, and Jeremiah Austell, the deputy marshal, as accessories. Austell was arrested, and an attachment was issued for Maj. James S. McIntosh in command at Fort Mitchell, who was cited for contempt of court, because he would not deliver up the soldier under his command. Excitement increased, and a clash between the militia of Alabama and the marshal and the federal military force impended. The marshal called on Major McIntosh at Fort Mitchell for a detachment of 50 troops to accompany him to Polecat Springs, where he proposed to remove some intruders. McIntosh declined for the reason that he feared the marshal's action would precipitate bloodshed, and there was not enough ammunition at the garrison to enable the soldiers to defend themselves against the citizens who were arming for combat. On October 31 the President employed Francis Scott Key to go to Alabama, investigate the conditions in connection with the killing of Owen, and assist the United States District Attorney in defending the indicted officers and soldiers. Key arrived in Alabama in the early part of November and reported that the evils of the intruders were caused by the weakness of the United States government in the face of the aggressive action of the white people of Alabama. He said that had the first orders for removal been backed up and rigidly enforced, the present situation would not have existed. Key explained to the governor and the members of the legislature the government's recession from its demands and the proposition that the most flagrant violators of the rights of the Indians would be removed and others permitted to remain, to which the state officials expressed their approval. The speculators in Indian titles, he said, hoped to sustain the leases by which they held Indian lands by force of the state laws. The dread of the Indians of being sued in the courts in which they could not testify and then taken to jail would make them submit to every oppression. Land speculating companies in Columbus, he said, had bought up between 3,000 and 4,000 Indian reserves, advancing in each case about $10. They relied on leases to put them in possession, until the time when they could demand a deed for a consideration based on fraudulent accounts that were run against them for whiskey and other items calculated to deceive the Indians. The condition of the Indians was deplorable, Key wrote. Most of them were almost starving, few of them had made any corn, and nearly all had sold their land 2 or 3 times over for any trifle that had been offered them. I met crowds of them going to Columbus with bundles of fodder on their heads to sell, and saw numbers of them in the streets there where they exchanged everything they carried for whiskey. Key reported on November 14 that the officials in the office of the Russell County District Court refused to let him see the indictment against the government officers. That the whites undoubtedly would have lynched the men and officers for the killing of Owen if they could have got possession of them. They declared that resistance to the federal authority was legal and justifiable, and that they were going to prosecute the officers and deputy marshal in the state court for murder. Key said it would be impossible to induce the Indians to send a delegation to Washington to treat for removal and sale of their land to the government, as the speculators and their agents had the Indians completely in their power. The state authorities proposed that in consideration of permitting the whites to remain on the lands where they were the least obnoxious to the Indians, prosecution of the officers charged with killing Owen would be dropped. Key said there were 10,000 whites living in the Creek country. By December he had arrived at an understanding with the Alabama authorities by which the latter agreed to pass measures to help enforce the federal laws and prevent speculators from harassing the Indians under the state laws in consideration of concessions to be made by the government. Registered Key then returned to Washington by way of the Ohio River steamboats and stagecoach. All this turmoil, excitement, and bitterness had resulted from the premature and illegal activities of the whites. For it was not until November 1833 that the surveys were completed so that the individual Indian reserves could be designated, the certifying agents could begin their work, and legal conveyances could be made. In the meantime, some efforts had been made to induce the Indians to remove from Alabama. In January 1833, former Governor George M. Trupp of Georgia asked the Secretary of War to appoint his cousin Chili McIntosh an agent for the removal of the Creeks. 1 McIntosh and Benjamin Hawkins of the Western Creeks were in the Old Creek Nation in a pretended effort to adjust the differences between the two factions of the tribe. The Eastern Creeks granted 5 sections of the 25 at their disposal under the treaty to the Western Creeks. This grant was made to bind a treaty of amity between the two factions by which they mutually pledged themselves to the observance of a lasting friendship. The Western Creeks gave McIntosh and Robert Tiger a power of attorney to sell the 5 sections, registered, but later became suspicious of McIntosh and revoked the authority. 2 McIntosh employed every artifice to induce the Creeks to enroll for removal, but he was mainly interested in securing from them powers of attorney authorizing a swindling land company of Columbus, Georgia, with which he was associated, to dispose of their lands. When this was discovered, his commission was rescinded on May 4. 1833.71 The result of the efforts of McIntosh was about 60 emigrants all told, 40 of whom were brought to Fort Gibson in the early part of September and 20 by Benjamin Hawkins a few months earlier. The necessity of emigration was everywhere obvious. Benjamin Marshall and McIntosh reported to Colonel Abbott that the starving Indians were worked upon and furnished whiskey by the whites, and everything they had, even the corn issued to them, was carried to the grog shop. In September, the heads of the families of Schesehoga town, with a total population of 236, received permission from the Chickasaw Indians to remove to their nation. They petitioned the government for assistance in making the change, as they were heavily involved in debt to white people where they were living. They said they desired to join the Creeks living in the Chickasaw Nation, who were their family connections, so that they could all travel together when the emigration began. Registered in November, Abbott wrote to the Secretary of War that all those who had sold are ready to move west as soon as the sales are approved, and the balances due paid them. The difficulties to which they have been exposed by intruders, and by the laws of Alabama, have had no small share in promoting this spirit. They linger, however, about their homes with great fondness, and arrest any disposition to move on the slightest evidence of adequate protection where they are. A deputation had been nominated to visit the Arkansas, and select a place for those disposed to emigrate. It was not sent, however, as the marshal appeared to move off intruders at the time it was ready to depart, which was considered and acted upon as evidence that they might remain unmolested where they were. For in the summer of 1834 extensive arrangements were made by the Commissary General of Subsistence for the removal of the Creeks from Alabama. A superintendent and 2 assistant agents were appointed from among the citizens of that state and Capt. John Page, an experienced dispersing officer, was associated with them. The government officials were expecting a large number of Creeks to come forward for emigration, but their hopes were not well founded as the Indians refused to go with the Alabamans. Only 630 Creeks enrolled for removal under the humane Captain Page, and they began their march in December. They traveled by way of Tuscaloosa, the capital of the state. Registered, these Indians were poor and almost destitute of clothing, and the winter was unusually severe. It rained, snowed, and froze nearly every day. They began the day's journey at 4 o'clock in the morning and traveled until night to make as much as 6 to 10 miles. The cold weather was so severe on the little children and old persons, and some of them nearly naked, that they would perish if they were not attended to, wrote Captain Page from Columbus, Mississippi. Registered, these pitiful children and sick people were compelled to lie on wet or frozen tents in the wagons, for there was not time to dry them after a night of rain or snow. I have to stop the wagons to take the children out and warm them and put them back again 6 or 7 times a day. I send ahead and have fires built for this purpose. I wrap them in tents and anything I can get hold of to keep them from freezing. Strict attention had to be paid to this, or some must inevitably have perished. 2 Registered, 5 or 6 in each wagon, constantly crying in consequence of suffering with cold. I am sometimes at a stand to know how to get along under existing circumstances. Their distress wrung the heart of this compassionate officer, who wrote again, "There was continued crying from morning to night with the children. I used to encourage them by saying that the weather would moderate in a few days and it would be warm, but it never happened during the whole trip." When they reached Memphis, the steamboat Harry Hill was engaged to convey the Creeks to Fort Gibson, but the boat was delayed several days by high winds on the Mississippi River, and 2 or 3 days by the ice on the Arkansas River. On the 24th, 20 days from Memphis, they arrived at Little Rock, where shallow water prevented further progress. Here the Indians were put ashore to join another contingent in charge of their 200 ponies. Degree owing to the near-naked condition of most of them and the great number of sick in the party, they remained in camp for a week, during which time a number died. March 1st, with a hint of spring in the air, the party with their few small wagons resumed their land journey. On the off march, when we were about 150 miles from Fort Gibson, we had a very severe snowstorm and the roads were impassable for all carriages of every description. Except those employed in the emigration, I do not recollect of meeting anyone but 2 or 3 horse carts, and they gave it up when they struck the road that we came over. There was nothing but prying out wagons from morning to night. This wretched journey lasted 3 months, and it was March 28, 1835, when Page delivered 469 survivors of his original party at the Western Creek Agency near Fort Gibson. Included among them was Sampson Grayson, who had with him 34 slaves, besides 23 slaves belonging to the widow Stidham. Most of this party settled around a leading man named Neahola, about 5 miles west of the crossing of the Verdigris River. This was in the section settled 5 or 6 years before by the McIntosh Creeks, who retired in advance of the newcomers and hastened to appropriate other choice lands higher up the Arkansas River, some of them locating in the vicinity of the present city of Tulsa. The improvements vacated by them were gratefully occupied by the members of Captain Page's party. Any Creek heads of families died after the Treaty of 1832, offering rich plunder to white vultures in Alabama and Georgia. The courts permitted white men to administer on the estates of these people, and by devious means they secured for a trifle title to the half-section of land to which the deceased was entitled, leaving nothing for his family or heirs. But these people soon evolved a simpler method for robbing the Indians of their lands. Agents were appointed in November 1833, to witness the execution and delivery of deeds by the Indians, and the payment of the considerations, and then to certify them to the President for approval. The work of locating the Indians was completed in January 1834, and the certification of conveyances began. The Indians knew nothing of the value of land or of business transactions, they spoke only their own language, and the temptation, to corrupt men to take advantage of their helpless condition was so alluring that almost from the first complaints of fraudulent practices were made. Reports of manifold instances of fraud and injustices were conveyed in March 1834, by the certifying agents, J. W. A. Sanford and Dr. Robert W. McHenry, but Abbott in a private letter warned them of the confusion that would result if their charges reached Washington. Sanford then admitted his error and said, "I am now sensible of the utter futility of any attempt to prevent their occurrence, and agree with yourself that the proper redress is with our own tribunals." In spite of their efforts to cover them up, information of these frauds did reach Washington, but Secretary Cass comforted Sanford and other residents of Columbus with the assurance that the frauds were clearly beyond your reach as they are beyond the reach of this office. As these reports reached Washington from time to time, the agents were cautioned to exercise greater vigilance to protect the Indians, but nothing adequate was directed or attempted. This infamous business was permitted to run along until it seemed well established that the swindlers had little to fear from the government. They then prepared for a drive that would yield a speedy and lucrative harvest. So bold had they become that there was fierce competition among the rival companies, and men engaged in this business said that as so many others were in it, each intended to have a share. Artful schemes and devices gave impunity and success to bold bad men, whose profligate and wanton conduct not only extended their operations, but became utterly regardless of public observation and opinion, until at length, in the spring of 1835, every prudential restraint was set at defiance, and acts which should make men cover their faces and shun daylight, came to be the boast of these despoilers of Indian property. I have never seen corruption carried on to such proportions in all of my life before. A number of the land purchasers think it rather an honor than a dishonor to defraud the Indian out of his land. In the neighboring town of Columbus, Georgia, a few score of enterprising citizens banded themselves into rival companies to plan and to carry into effect the most detestable and heartless frauds upon the Indians to be found in history. These men associated with them Luther Blake, a former Creek agent, and Paddy Carr, an intelligent educated half-breed Creek Indian. They organized themselves and set out systematically to steal the land from the Indians, and by force of their numbers and influence in the country they were very successful. Their method was to drill or coach an Indian who had sold his land or never owned any, to represent another who was the holder of a reservation. He learned his name and that of his tribe and town where he lived, the situation of his dwelling, and of the town square and council house, and such other circumstances as the agent would be likely to inquire into, with the view of identifying the reservee, and, thus prepared, he was presented before the agent, and, answering readily the usual questions, the officer was deceived, the contract certified, and the proprietor of the land defrauded. The wages of this combined iniquity were generally $5 or $10. Another method employed was taking the true Indian before the agent, and in his presence paying the consideration money, which was afterwards obtained from him by fraud or force by the pretended purchaser. The swindlers gathered the Indians in parties sometimes numbering several hundred near the office of the certifying agent but out of his sight, where they were fed and given whiskey while awaiting to be called before the agent. When commissioners were later directed to investigate these frauds, they said, "It is shocking to reflect on the disclosures elicited. They embrace men of every degree. Persons, heretofore deemed respectable, are implicated in the most disgraceful attempts to defraud those incapacitated from protecting their own interests. In some instances it was found that 19 out of 20 deeds certified had been procured by fraud. Evidence taken disclosed acts that make the blood of a just man mount to his cheeks for shame that he and the perpetrators of them belong to the same community. Registered near the town of Cusseta, in which Dr. P.C. Henry certified, Indians were collected in large bodies, amounting to 400 or 500, and from that to 1,000 were encamped in the woods, which, in the language of one witness, appeared to be full of them, and were fed by and under the direction avowedly of the agents of those to whom the largest number of contracts was certified, that all regard for appearances even was abandoned, and no attempts at secrecy in their movements was made, and that threats and menace were used by some of those engaged in this business against the persons who exposed their unprincipled proceedings. That early in March, 1835, the land stealers were crowding into the office by droves, and certifying contracts very fast, and it appeared as though they would steal all the Indians' land. They seemed to carry on the business in sport, that a toast was given in a crowd by one of those concerned in these nefarious practices: "Here's to the man that can steal the most land tomorrow without being caught at it," and that such a flood of fraud inundated the agency that Dr. D.D.C. Henry closed his books. This business exhibited scenes at which principle revolts and the heart sickens. March 1, 1835, Eli S. Shorter, one of the leaders in this business, wrote from Columbus to some of his associates at Tuscaloosa: "I left at the agency Hayden and his son, General Woodward, Stone, McBride, Collins, the whole at Columbus Company and a host of others, with, I believe, 400 Indians hid out all around the hill. Identifications commenced last evening and about 60 were taken through. The agent will be at home certifying the whole of next week, and in that time, most if not all of the land will be swept that is worth a notice. I have the agent's promise to meet us at any place of our appointment on the day afterwards." They were directed to gather up their Indians and bring them to the vicinity of Chambers, to use them over again as needed. At Ampure Indians out of sight of the road. "You need give yourself no trouble about the value of the land, I will arrange all that." Stealing is the order of the day, and out of that host of Indians at the agency, I do not think there were 10 true holders of land. Finally, on March 7, 1835, after the harvest was nearly over, Secretary Cass undertook to limit the frauds by directing that contracts should be certified only in the towns in which the Indian grantors lived. But he was too late and this order did no good. On March 16 and again a week later the Indians protested to the certifying agent: "We have borne with oppression until further forbearance has ceased to be a virtue, and we are now determined to speak out, let the consequences be as they may. While we have been at home preparing something for our dependent families to subsist on, other Indians have sold our homes, our all, the only means for our support, and when we have applied to you for redress, what has most frequently been the result? Why, sir, that you would inquire into it. You place the burden of proof upon us. But worse than all this, and more to be regretted, is the fact, through fear of the merciless hordes who surround your office, our people cannot speak to you in defense of their just rights without subjecting themselves to punishment. A better class of white people of Chambers County, Alabama, indignant at these outrages, judiciously conscious of the chaotic condition of titles to follow, and predicting the Indian hostilities, suffering, and bloodshed that resulted, protested to the President April 8, 1835, against what had become in less than 2 months a regular business, not more distinguished for its baseness and corruption than for the boldness with which it is carried into execution. In the same month a grand jury in that county indicted a justice of the peace for promoting these frauds by signing in blank a large number of affidavits of ownership to be filled in by the swindlers at their convenience. Finally the frantic appeals of the Indians supported by the protests of decent resident white people began to have some effect, and more than a year after it had been first apprised of these frauds, the administration at Washington reversed its attitude of indifference and futility, and on April 28, 1835 orders were issued to stop certifying sales and to investigate all those already approved. Directions were given to General Sanford to make an investigation. Accordingly, he gave notice that he would proceed to hear complaints from the Indians at Columbus in June, 1835. This proposition to make the investigation in the city in which these infamous schemes were conceived and promoted, and where most of the land thieves lived, was foredoomed to failure, especially as Sanford himself was not trusted by the Indians. In spite of this handicap, a number of those whose lands had been fraudulently conveyed by others, gathered at the home of Eniamico, a Hitchiti chief, for the purpose of going to Columbus to present their grievances to Sanford. Agents of the land thieves frightened the Indians by telling them that the direction to come to Columbus was a device to get them in Georgia, where they would be arrested for old debts and enrolled and sent off to Arkansas. The result was that none went to see Sanford. Eniamico then sent word of the situation to Sanford and asked him to meet the Indians on the Alabama side of the Chattahoochee River, but Sanford refused. The Indians then, on August 25, 1835, again wrote the president about the situation and told him that they would like to begin their movement to the west, but they were unable to sell their land and get the proceeds. They could not depart until they had the money with which to remove and begin life anew in the west, which was promised them by the terms of the treaty, from the sale of their land. The president then appointed John B. Hogan, a friend of the Indians, to make an investigation. He traveled about among them taking testimony touching these frauds. On January 22 and February 14, 1836, Hogan wrote interesting accounts of his investigation. A greater mass of corruption perhaps has never been congregated in any part of the world than has been engendered by the Indians have so many claims set up against them that they have concealed the place of meeting. There was 2 jack-legged lawyers on the ground, threatening to sue if the Indians did not pay the claim they held. However, the Cherokee Indians, Ridge and Van, who stood high in favor with the administration, came to the council with a claim of $5,000 against the Creeks and a letter from the Secretary of War urging them to pay it. Feeling ran high and one Indian stabbed another on the council ground. The relations of the dead Indian immediately took the murderer, tied him to a tree and stabbed him to death and left his body hanging to the tree. There was a great many white persons on the ground, but neither them or the chiefs took any notice of the affair. Percent 4. Ith assurances that the fraud investigation and all difficulties involving their lands would be adjusted by autumn. Large numbers of the Indians, even the recalcitrant chief Eniamico of the Lower Creeks, agreed to prepare for emigration. This compliance was induced by the supposition that they were to be removed by John B. Hogan, the agent appointed for that purpose, whom all the Indians trusted. Hundreds were being enrolled and the agents were enthusiastic over the prospects for removal, when the government agents, with a singular genius for bungling, destroyed all that had been accomplished. A contract for the removal of the Indians was let to a company made up principally of the men who had been most active in stealing their lands, and for whom the Indians cherished implacable hatred. They declared they would never consent to be delivered into the hands of these men, whose primary interest would be to save as much as possible out of the $20 a head allowed by the contract for removal. The movement collapsed. However, Opethliahalo continued to make preparations to emigrate. He announced in September that his town, the Tuckabaquis, with that of the Kialachis, Tlaplaco Etlawalas, Otagas, and Otosis, who all burn the same fire and talk with the same tongue, forms all the Tuckabaches, and is the great leading town of the nation. Have set apart the 15th day of next month for our final departure. We shall at that time take our last black drink in this nation, rub up our tradition plates, and commence our march. He said he had prepared his marching physic and was preparing his traveling clothes, and will put out his old fire and never make or kindle it again until he reaches west of the Mississippi, there never to quench it again. However, new difficulties arose. Suits were filed by white men against the Indians. The chiefs and head men who were solvent feared that if they attempted to leave, the whites would attach their negroes, horses, and other property. Many influences worked against removal. The Indians could not understand why they, the heirs of dead members of their families, were not entitled to possess or convey the lands inherited by them, which the white courts insisted on administering and selling. Any Indian who had anything of value, land, or money, was the victim of white greed until he had been thoroughly despoiled of everything. Many were embarrassed by debts to speculators and they were threatened with attachments if they attempted to remove. Others were detained by white land buyers who induced them to believe they could recover land or money from competitors who had already paid for their land, and a large number would not consent to leave until the fraudulent complications over their land were adjusted. Many of the Creeks had sold all their provisions, corn, and cattle so they would be ready for removal. Numbers had become destitute having sold their land and dissipated the proceeds, or having been evicted by fraudulent purchasers, they became wanderers, wretched and miserable, and a menace to the whites. Finding no refuge among the latter, they began drifting into the Cherokee country in Alabama and Georgia until in February, 1836, 2,500 destitute and hungry Creeks of the Sacapatay, Gontcati, Taleshatchee, and Talladega towns found shelter among their red brothers who were themselves soon to be evicted. A company of Georgia militia attacked and fired on 50 of these Creeks who were encamped on the Georgia side of the Coosa River, killing and injuring a number of the Indians. The Georgians afterwards killed some defenseless old Indians who were picking cotton along the Chattahoochee River. Because the Indians attempted to defend themselves, the Georgia General of Militia ordered 1,000 men to assemble for the purpose of crossing the river and attacking the Indians in Alabama. Thus, said an army officer registered, the Georgians had started the war. The Creeks who were driven from Georgia back into Alabama, took refuge among the Cherokee living in that state. Gov. Clement C. Clay requested of the Secretary of War permission to drive them by force to the banks of the Tennessee River and compel them to take boats there for the West, but the Secretary reminded him that under the terms of the treaty, the Creeks were free to leave Alabama when and as they pleased. Registered, however, removal was not entirely abandoned. Opatliahalo promised that he and his people would be ready to remove by the next April. Benjamin Marshall, a half-breed Creek, a member of the emigrating company that had the contract for the removal of the Creeks, was anxious to take his family and slaves to the west that autumn. He was an influential member of the tribe, and largely through his efforts an emigrant party of 511 was organized on the Tallapoosa River near Wetumpka December 6, 1835. The party was made up of members from Fish Pond, Keelgee, Hillaby, and Assalanaby towns. They were accompanied by Marshall, who had with him his family of 8, and his 19 slaves. The party was conducted by Lieutenant Edward Diaz of the Army, detailed to see that the conditions of the contract for caring for the Indians were observed by the contractors, represented by Dr. Ingersoll. The agent attempted to enroll the Indians of his party in Tallapoosa County, but he found it impossible to get a correct roll in the nation in the vicinity of so many grog shops, and he was obliged to take them across the Coosa River before he could count them. Traveling about 12 miles each day, they passed through Montevallo, and forded the Cahaba River on the 11th, passed Elliton, crossed 2 forks of the Black Warrior River, the West Fork of Flint Creek, Moulton on the 19th, and arrived at Tuscumbia the 21st. Hearing discouraging reports about the condition of the roads, Diaz decided to take the Indians from here by boat. Sending their horses in charge of the contractors to be driven through by volunteer Indians, the remainder of the party, their wagons, beef, and corn were embarked December 23 on a small steamboat and 2 keel boats that carried them down the river to Waterloo. Here they were placed aboard the steamboat Alpha and 2 large keel boats in tow for the passage to Fort Gibson, and departed the 26th. They stopped every evening before dark to clean the boats and enable the Indians to camp on shore, and started again after daylight. Temporary hearths were constructed on the decks of the keel boats which the Indians employed to cook their food and warm themselves. Fresh beef and meal were issued to them daily. Registered, the emigrants reached the mouth of the Tennessee River December 28, and Memphis the 31st, at the same time their ponies arrived there. The Indians had been allowed only 2 quarts of corn for each horse a day on the road, which proved wholly inadequate for horses driven as rapidly as they were, twice as fast as the rate specified in the contract, and the Indians had been obliged to exchange horses for feed along the way until out of a total of 154 that left Tuscumbia December 23, only 132 reached the Mississippi River, leaving Memphis the day of their arrival. The boats soon entered the Arkansas River, and after a passage averaging 40 files a day reached Little Rock on January 9, where they were anchored for an hour in the stream, the Indians not being permitted to go ashore. Registered Diaz made every effort to prevent introduction in the party by white men of whiskey, which in spite of all they could do gave Diaz and the conductors much trouble. After delays occasioned by having to go ashore and cut wood for the boilers, where the wood yards had been depleted, and by repeatedly running aground on sandbars, or running on snags and springing leaks in the boats, at times obliging all but the sick to walk while they worked the boats over the shallows, they finally reached a point 2 miles above Fort Smith on January 22, when low water prevented further progress of the boats. The emigrants were obliged to wait here a week until messengers sent to Fort Gibson could secure the return of their ponies that through bad management had been driven ahead. They then loaded their household utensils and other personal effects in 10 wagons, 3 with 6 oxen to each, 4 with 4 oxen, 1 with 4 oxen and 1 horse, 1 with 4 horses, and 1 with 6 mules, besides a number of small wagons and carts belonging to the Indians. Then mounting their ponies and wagons, the Indians began the last stage of their journey. They traveled the military road, crossed Salisaw Creek, and on the 31st camped at Mackey's 18 miles from Fort Gibson, forded the Illinois River and reached the post February 2. Then they continued to the west side of the Verdigris River where they desired to locate. With the passing of winter, the Indians in Alabama were voluble with promises to remove, not now but as soon as the interminable investigation of the frauds would clear their titles so they could sell their lands and take the proceeds with them. Sanford's company was predicting that as many as 8,000 would remove in the spring, and it was making arrangements accordingly. But conditions did not justify the hope. Thousands of the Indians were destitute, dispossessed of their lands, some legitimately, but most of them by fraud. Of this class were the Yuchi, nearly all of whom were compelled to leave their homes and wander over the surrounding country, stealing and killing stock to keep from starving. The white people in the vicinity, panic-stricken, abandoned their homes. Early in May, 1836, removal agents with much labor induced nearly 2,000 more Indians to assemble ready to depart for the west. While they were in camp, Opatliahalo was arrested and held under a bail writ for a debt for which he was as much responsible as he is for the national debt of Great Britain, according to Sanford. Registered, the chief sent word to the Indians not to leave until he was released and could accompany them. From their lack of confidence in themselves and in the white contractors, and their reliance on Opatliahalo, they declined to attempt the journey until he was ready to go. The Secretary of War on March 11, directed J.B. Hogan and 2 other commissioners named by him to make a new investigation of the frauds on the creeks and to push it vigorously. They had begun their work and were making progress, when early in May hostilities were begun by the Indians. The opinion was general that they were planned and promoted by the white despoilers of the Indians in order to interrupt and prevent investigations of their villainy and thereby cover it up, and hasten the validating of the bogus titles procured by them. Roving bands of Yuchi, Hitchiti, and Kyaha towns of the lower creeks situated on the Chattahoochee River suddenly began attacking white people and destroying their property. These hostilities and depredations took place near Columbus, where they were certain to receive the greatest amount of publicity. And the Indians entered into the destruction of property with greater fury in the vicinity of the city in which the wrongs perpetrated upon them had been planned and promoted. Between Tuskegee and Columbus a number of whites were murdered and the rest fled and abandoned the country to the Indians, who robbed and burned houses, barns, and cribs, burned the toll bridge across the Chattahoochee River, fired upon and captured 2 steamboats on that stream near Columbus. As that town had harbored the swindlers who had done the most to drive the Indians to desperation, it was but natural that the citizens should have feared reprisals. Of May 16, a company of 50 or 60 Indians attacked a mail stage about 20 miles west of Columbus on the road to Tuskegee, robbed and burned the stage and killed some of the passengers. To this act they were incited by a white man who was later tried and on November 21 of that year sentenced to hang for his participation in this affair. Panic-stricken white people fled to Columbus with such of their worldly possessions as they could carry, until the place was crowded with them, their horses, oxen and wagons. Indians who were not involved in these excesses, starving and fearful of the cruelty of the whites, came flocking into Fort Mitchell where they were fed. "We have men, women, and children more than can get inside of the pickets," wrote Captain Page of the Post. 1 Registered hostilities between the Seminoles and whites in Florida had intensified the fears of the people, and the War Department directed the issue of arms and ammunition in Alabama, but on March 109, the Secretary wrote Governor Clay that no occasion existed for organizing a regiment in his state and directed the discharge of all troops that had gathered. Registered citizens of Barber and Russell counties, from Wetumpka and Montgomery, were sending to Governor Clay alarming reports of depredations and killings committed by the Indians which, it was claimed, indicated a concerted plan of the lower Creeks to go to war. The governor then made another call on Secretary Cass for authority to raise a force of troops to act against them. He also ordered Gen. Gilbert Shearer, at the head of the state militia, to prepare to carry on the war against the Creeks whenever it became necessary. But Shearer advised the government that there was nothing to apprehend from the Indians unless the daily intrusions committed on them by the whites should drive them to desperation. I also find this same view of the subject taken by the editor of a Montgomery paper and also by that of the Georgia Journal. These prints convey that many persons are interested in producing an alarm and provoking hostilities, with the hope of diverting a scrutiny into their own fraudulent transactions with the Indians. The truth of the situation is probably to be found in the account in the Montgomery Advertiser, which presumably was not prejudiced in favor of the Indians. We must speak plain on this question. It is meet that everything relative to it should be properly understood. We do not censure the executive of Alabama for making preparations to resist the aggressions of a hostile foe. On the contrary, we approve of his motives. But we do deprecate the conduct of those who are continually sounding the cry of danger, when there is none to be apprehended. Is this country never to enjoy a season of repose? Are interested land speculators from Alabama and Georgia longer to palm off their deception on the public? Who believes that the Creeks are about to assume a hostile attitude towards the whites? We answer, no one. The war with the carts, many without tired wheels or indeed without iron of any kind. Owing to the war scare in Texas, most of the able-bodied men of the country had volunteered and departed for Fort Towson and Fort Gibson to replace the troops from those posts who had been sent to the Texas border. These volunteers had taken with them all the wagons and horses which might have been used for transporting the sick Indians, Lieutenant Berry with his large party having engaged all of the best wagons and teams in the country. However, by waiting several days at Arkansas Post, they were able to secure a few wretched carts, and the emigrants departed September 6. Deloved early and reached Robbins, 15 miles. The flies are most distressing, a horse can hardly be controlled from lying down to roll, such is the torment. The heat is excessive and the water of the worst description, some 45 sick, and constantly dropping, the ox teams breaking and carts tumbling to pieces. In 4 days they reached Mrs. Black's registered, where they secured 2 more wagons and continued over the roads filled with rocks and roots, that jostled the wretched sick passengers and broke down the carts. During the passage of the prairie, it has, with the exception of 2 days of scorching sun, rained almost all day and night. The situation of the Indians is deplorable, the sick exceed 50 of the small party, and death occasionally carries off the weakest. The wagons or carts have been overloaded and great difficulties surmounted. To reach settlements, forced marches have been necessary. Paid off and discharged the carts engaged at Post Arkansas, 3 additional wagons are engaged for Indians 1, and for officers' transportation. These are miserable small and old vehicles, poor teams and harness, but better cannot be done. The charges too are high indeed, the people taking advantage of an obvious necessity, and having heard of larger parties in the rear, very indifferent about engaging at all. What better can be done? The sick require attention to their situation and weakness and the very elements against us. Therefore's nothing better in prospect, the best wagons being with the large hostile party in charge of Lt. Berry and the volunteers marching from the neighboring settlements for Fort Towson have engaged every good thing of the kind at enormous prices. The country is sparsely settled, we are at the mercy of circumstances. A will collapses and the party is delayed while repairs are made. Torrents of rain fall incessantly, day after day, and the wretched emigrants toil and flounder through mud and water in what by courtesy were called roads, but were mere cutouts without draining or causeways. On September 19 the party reached the old home of Maj. William L. Lovely and crossed the Illinois Bayou on the ferry below the site of Old Dwight Mission. Normally small streams that had become raging torrents, delayed the party from time to time. Arrival at a country smithy was the signal for other delays while much needed repairs were made. The conductor and journalist Captain Belton was failing under fever and the tremendous hardships of the journey, and on the 27th he was too ill and weak to note in his journal just where he lay down on the wayside while the Indians struggled on under the direction of his assistant Dr. J. Jones. Only 165 of the original party of 210 put in charge of Captain Belton at Montgomery were finally delivered to Captain Stevenson on October 3. 17 had been taken by the civil authorities of Alabama, 19 had died on the way and 9 were missing and unaccounted for. The war was now over except for minor disturbances by a party of Eufaula warriors under Northcup Tustenuggee and other detached parties that had been driven into the swamps. Now began the enforced removal of the friendly Indians no longer needed to help the whites fight the hostiles. August 1, 700 Indians under the leadership of their faithful chief Opethliahalo began their march. This contingent in charge of Lieutenant M.W. Batman left Tallahassee August 31 but proceeded slowly owing to the difficulty of organizing and the demoralization occasioned by the arrest of a number of their principal men by whites to extort from them the little property they had been able hurriedly to salvage from the disaster that had overwhelmed them. The difficulties were so great that General Jessup began to fear the movement would fail entirely. Suits were multiplied against the Indians there. Negroes, horses, and other property taken, themselves driven almost to desperation by the difficulties which surrounded them, the greatest dissatisfaction prevailing among them. There seemed to be no means of getting them out of the country peaceably, but by enabling them to pay the just demands against them and defending them against those which were doubtful or unjust. *2 The chiefs insisted upon having pay for the land they were leaving, or advance payment of their annuity for 1,837. They had been denied the proceeds of the sale of their lands by the frauds committed upon them, and their enforced departure before the time specified in their treaty, and saw no way to begin life anew in their western home without the assistance of their annuities. At this time, when the women and children most needed their men to help them on their journey, to begin new homes and put in crops for sustenance, the President conceived the amazing policy of calling upon them for a force of their warriors to fight the Seminole Indians in Florida. This incomprehensible course was calculated to contribute to their helplessness and destitution. Taking advantage of their necessities, General Jessup made the furnishing of the force required by the President one of the conditions upon which he would comply with their demands. A contract was therefore executed August 28, 1836, between John A. Campbell, appointed by Jessup as a commissioner on the part of the United States, and Opethliahalo, Little Doctor, Tookabishee Miko, and Yeka Hadjo for the Creek Nation, by which the Indians were enabled to ransom themselves from the whites. By this contract the United States agreed to advance the Creek Indians their annuity of $31,900 to be applied to the payment of their alleged debts. This money was paid them in consideration of their agreement to furnish from their tribe 600 to 1,000 men for service against the Seminoles, to be continued in service until the same shall be conquered, they to receive the pay and emoluments and equipment of soldiers, in the army of the U.S. and such plunder as they may take from the Seminoles. The offer of plunder was understood to authorize the Creek warriors to keep such slaves as they could capture in Florida. Registered after these negotiations were completed and the rapacity of the whites temporarily was abated by the payment to them of the Indians' annuity advanced by the government, Batman's emigrants resumed their march September 2, and reached Tuscaloosa on the 12th. As this sad cavalcade of people passed through the town, a sympathetic observer remarked on their appearance, they all presented a squalid, forlorn, and miserable condition, and seemed to be under the influence of deep melancholy and deep dejection. They are said to have left their homes with great reluctance, but they are becoming more reconciled to their destiny. Their condition excited much sympathy and commiseration in the hearts of our citizens, and many a heartfelt regret was uttered at the necessity which compelled us to remove them to the far west. Batman reported no further interruption or trouble except that many of the Indians got drunk on whiskey furnished by white people in every town or village through which they passed. They arrived at Memphis October 7, and on the 13th 1,200 of them boarded the steamboat Farmer and after 4 days reached Rock Row where they began their land journey. More than 3 weeks later on November 8 the first division of this party in charge of Batman had traveled only 48 miles and arrived at the crossroads at Irwin's Stand 20 miles north of Little Rock. The roads are most horridly bad, said their conductor, rains have been falling almost every day. They arrived at Fort Gibson December 7 and the remainder of the party 4 days later. The march has been long, laborious, and tedious. The roads and weather have been indescribably bad. The Indians have suffered much, especially the old and infirm and children. 2 of the rear parties, say about 5,000 souls, arrived within the last 2 days. 2 parties are still in the rear, say about 6,000. I am fearful that they are detained by high water. The second detachment, composed of 3,022 Indians headed by William McGillivray and conducted by Lieutenant R.B. Screven, departed from Wetumpka August 6. It crossed the Coosa River September 3, and on reaching Memphis 6 weeks later, there were 3,142 in the party. From here they went by water to Rock Row, whence they resumed their land journey. They arrived at Little Rock on November 20 and went into camp across the river a mile and a half from the village. A stop here was necessitated by the fact that several hundred of their horses had been lost and the Indians suffered from a failure of the contractors to provide adequate supplies of corn and other provisions. What they succeeded in procuring was obtained at exorbitant prices. For hungry, straggling bands of this party dropped off here and there, killing hogs and stealing food to keep from starving, and only about 2,000 were delivered at Fort Gibson by Screven. Some of those who were left along the road were later placed on board the steamboat John Nelson, which went aground near Fort Coffee, and the Indians were put ashore to walk to Fort Gibson. Another party of 1,170 from Talladega Distillery, in charge of Lieutenant Edward Diaz, began their sad journey on August 6. These people were collected from Randolph, Benton, and Talladega counties, and included 400 Creeks captured by the troops in Tennessee. When they reached Gunter's Landing on the Tennessee River November 18, accessions there increased the number to 2,000. Diaz then returned to Talladega and brought another party of 2,320 over the same route. The first party crossed the Tennessee River at Deposit Landing September 25 and proceeded by way of Huntsville to Memphis, while the second, accompanied by Diaz, passed through Decatur and Cortland, arrived at Tuscumbia October 2 and on the 25th reached Memphis, where its members found their neighbors who had preceded them. Both parties camped half a mile below Memphis on the bank of the Mississippi to await transportation across the river. By early November it was reported from Memphis, "Our town and vicinity have been filled and no little annoyed for the past 2 weeks by the emigrating through the swamp. Blackfish is distant from Memphis 25 miles, its width is about 150 yards. The water is clear and its surface smooth, although there is a tolerably strong current, which empties into the St. Francis. Roth, July, Camp Guy. Left Blackfish at 8 o'clock A2. And traveled over boggy roads and through mud and water, frequently up to axle trees of the wagons. The distance we came today is about 8 miles and by every person acquainted with the roads, considered a good drive. Rith, Camp Marietta, 3 miles west of St. Francis. This has been a laborious drive today, but thanks to good fortune has taken us through the great Mississippi swamp, without any serious accident or ill luck but some slight injury to the wagons, which, as we remain here tomorrow, can be easily repaired. The sick who were sent by water to this place, are convalescent, one yet remains on the sick report. The next day after emerging from the great swamp they spent in resting their horses and oxen and adjusting their baggage. During the following week they made from 6 to 15 miles a day, sometimes delayed by Indians who lingered behind along the road. On the 17th they reached White River at the mouth of Cache Creek and consumed 2 days in ferrying the river with their horses and wagons and proceeded 4 miles to Rock Row Bridge. They then continued 4 miles through the White River bottom and reached the prairie. All the Indians, now, more than 500 in number, are in camp and impatient for their march through the great prairie. The next few days were uneventful. To avoid the heat the caravan departed from Rock Row at 6 o'clock on the evening of the 20th and before daylight arrived at Mrs. Black's. Here they remained in camp all day, resumed their march at 2 o'clock that night, and after traveling 9 miles camped again for the day. This program was repeated until they reached the Arkansas River opposite Little Rock on the 24th. The party now contained 516 emigrating Indians, 551 ponies, and 13 wagons. 30 other Indians not enrolled were in the rear. 26th July. Remained in camp all day and made preparations for an early start in the morning. At a late hour today Lt. Doris came to our camp and informed that rations had not been thrown on the roads, on account of the impossibility of procuring wagons. This being unexpected, caused some little delay, also some difficulty having arisen with the Indians as to the road they would go. They were told by Amubi, a chief of the nation, that they should go by the Red River route, and some of them are determined to do so, though contrary to the positive directions of myself and all concerned in the emigration. 8 o'clock. 2. The Indians, after being twice in council, concluded to disobey the wishes of the conductor and go as they had been directed by their chief. After much persuasion, however, they, by way of compromise, agreed that their women, children, and infirm should go on board the steamer Indian and proceed to the Adhokta nation by water, and that the young men with the chief Sealy should go by land with the horses. 27th July. We now believed that all difficulty was settled to their satisfaction, but we were deceived. The baggage was scarcely on board the boat, when Sealy the chief came and informed me that about 300 of his men would go with him by way of Fort Towson and would go no other way. They could not be persuaded from this intention by all the arguments and instructions of the conductors and such citizens of Little Rock as were acquainted with the Indian character and the country through which they were compelled to pass. They were told the comparative distance of the routes and the impossibility of procuring food on any but the fort, and a talk was held to them by myself, in which was stated in the most positive manner and plainest terms, their unaccountable and singular conduct, and the rule and duty they should in future perform, and as an agent of government I was determined to exact, after which at Apt. Morris read the following letter to them: Washita at Rossing, August 19, 1837. Sir, I deem it my duty to report to the officer U.S. Army commanding at Fort Towson, that a party of 350 Chickasaw Indians now emigrating to their district under John II. Willard conducting agent and myself as Dis-G officer, have refused to proceed. They throw their baggage out of the teams which have been provided for their transportation, say they will have their own time and manner to get to their country, and seem to take great satisfaction in disregarding all directions and orders they receive from us. These Indians crossed the Arkansas River at Little Rock on the 25th of July, to go to Fort Towson, contrary to the orders of Adage Upshaw the Supt of Chickasaw removal and the agents in charge of them, and have only progressed to this place, a distance of 45 miles. They hunt and loiter about the habitations of the citizens and create serious apprehensions and complaints among them. They have not shown the least disposition to be hostile, but there is behind their action something I cannot account for. Under all the circumstances I believe it would be very proper to use military force to compel them to remove, and accordingly request you to dispatch to this place with as little delay as possible 2 companies of infantry to conduct these Indians out of the state of Arkansas to their proper territory. Gouverneur Morris. Commanding Officer, U.S. Army, Fort Towson. This threat to remove the Indians at the point of the bayonet was effective, and as they agreed to follow instruction thereafter, Lieutenant Morris did not send his requisition to Fort Towson. The whole company came up to the Washita River on the 20th and encamped on the right bank. The ponies and horses recruited themselves by feeding on the young cane growing on the bottom lands. The next morning an infant died. The Indians went only 5 miles and stopped to bury the child. Nearly all day the weather was extremely hot and the country very broken. At Prairie Bayou one of the wagons broke down. It was unloaded and discharged. The weather and country same as yesterday. Nearly all the camps were provided with venison and turkeys, it being the best hunting ground on the whole route. The Indians had several very fine horses stolen. At Caddo Crossing the conductor hired a team to send back for the sick and the load which had been left at the Bayou Prairie yesterday. On the 24th there was great difficulty in collecting the Indian ponies and horses. Some were lost, in consequence of which we started very late in the day. The next day they reached Antoine Bridge. At this camp several valuable horses were stolen. It appeared that there was a gang of horse thieves who followed the Indians and robbed them whenever they could get an opportunity, notwithstanding all the precautions the Indians took to guard their camp. August 27th. Traveled to Little Missouri River, 11 miles, weather very hot and water scarce. At this camp the cane was excellent for the ponies. There was no house on the way for 7 miles to Fresboro, the seat of justice of Pike County. The citizens of this place evinced great desire to sell ardent spirits to the Indians. They followed the train 3 miles to the river, with a large supply of whiskey, and introduced it in camp the next morning at the very moment the Indians had mounted their horses to start, and in fact after about one half of them had taken the road. August 28. The wagons and perhaps the third of the Indians went to Briar Creek, 11 miles. Ioki Tubby and the remainder of the Indians tarried at Missouri River the whole day, indulging in dissipation. August 29. The party all came up, several of them much intoxicated. The country for several miles around this place is a scrub oak barren, affording little or no grass, and as many horses had previously been stolen from the Indians, I directed them to keep their horses up, and fodder to be procured for them. It may be proper to suggest in this place the necessity and propriety for the government to issue forage to the horses of emigrating Indians while on their route. By this means the horses would not stray from at Amp. They would be always strong and in good condition, enabled to perform long marches every day, actually prevent great delay and expense in the emigration, and at the same time the Indians would not lose their animals by being stolen or broken down from famine and fatigue. The next few days were uneventful except for delay occasioned by the illness of Samuel Seeley's son, who died on the 3rd of September on Rock Creek and was buried there the next day. September 5. Capt. Morris and myself proceeded to David Folsom's 22 miles west of the line, to make arrangements to furnish the Indians with rations and enroll them. There being no agent present to receive them, we remained until the 9th inst to enable the whole party to get up. A contract was made by Capt. Morris with David Folsom for 8 cents per ration registered, and on the 8th and 9th I completed the enrollment, a copy of which I left for Mr. Kingsbury, the acting agent. On the 10th inst, Capt. Morris and myself proceeded via Fort Coffee on our way to join Maj. Upshaw at Pontotoc. Mi registered. When Superintendent Upshaw saw his emigrants safely across the Mississippi River, he returned to the Chickasaw Nation to recruit the remainder of the tribe. And by November 9 he had assembled at Memphis 4,000 Indians whom he proposed to remove by water. Registered. A contract was made with Capt. Simeon Buckner of Kentucky to transport the Indians from Memphis to Fort Coffee in steamboats at the rate of $14.50 each. For that purpose Buckner assembled 6 vessels at Memphis. As the Indians approached the Mississippi River, however, they began to hear accounts of the sinking of the steamboat Seven Mouth in the river below Memphis, with the loss of over 300 Creek emigrants. The Chickasaw became panic-stricken, and many refused to board the boats. Upshaw had started 4 boats with Indians by November 25, and was preparing to send another. Those that are going by land have been crossing the river for several days, and it is likely they will be crossed in 3 or 4 days. The Hickasaws have an immense quantity of baggage. A great many of them have fine wagons and teams. They have also some 4 or 5,000 ponies. I have used all the influence that I had to get them to sell off their horses, but they would about as lieve part with their lives as part with a horse. Fortunately there was a rise in the Arkansas River that enabled the boats to ascend at good speed. The DeKalb passed Little Rock on the 22nd with 500 Indians on board, the Kentuckian on the 28th with 800, and the John Nelson the next day, and they all completed the journey and discharged their passengers at Fort Coffee in from 8 to 10 days. Those who went by land were divided into 3 parties under conductors Langtry, Wellborn, and Millard. Upshaw left Memphis December 3 with 227 more emigrants on the second trip of the steamer Fox, arrived at Little Rock 4 days later, and Fort Coffee on the 12th. Captain Millard left the west bank of the Mississippi River about the same time with a large number of Indians traveling by land with their ponies. They encountered tremendous difficulties. On the 11th it was reported from St. Francis that Capt. John Millard, conductor of a party of Chickasaw Indians, reached Strong's last evening with about 800 Indians, 38 wagons, and 1,100 ponies. The balance of this party, supposed to be from 700 to 800 in number, is still in the swamp, and will not reach here for some days owing to the desperate condition of the road. At APT, Millard thinks that not less than 70 or 80 ponies have been bogged and left dead in the mud. This party will remain here until the balance of the party come up. They later proceeded, and at Little Rock Millard induced some of those who were weary of land travel to board steamboats for the remainder of the journey. Most of them, however, with their horses and oxen continued overland, in charge of Captain Phillips registered. Another land party of emigrants under conductor Wellborn, having a large number of ponies, lay in camp for several days on the north side of the Arkansas River opposite Little Rock. 200 or 300 of them were induced to embark on the steamboat Cavalier and leave that place on December 17, the remainder of them with their ponies continuing by land. During this movement the steamboat Itasca carried up the river 800 creeks in charge of R.B. Crockett, who had gathered them up in the Chickasaw Nation and delivered them at Fort Gibson about the end of the year. Another party of Chickasaw known as the Bear Creek Indians boarded a boat at Memphis December 28 in charge of Captain Phillips, bound for Fort Coffee. Registered another came by land with their livestock and arrived at Fort Coffee about January 20, having lost between 500 and 600 horses and oxen on the way. After the principal body of emigrants had left the east, a company of 175 Chickasaw Indians, followers of Kinhi-Cha, known in the nation as the Clean House Indians, departed with 206 horses and oxen, and arrived at Memphis on January 18, 1838.1. They were then enrolled by Mr. Crockett, who, finding that the Mississippi swamps were impassable, placed them on the steamer Itasca, and their livestock on flatboats towed by her, and disembarked them at Arkansas Post. By this arrangement no horses or oxen were lost in the swamps. They then proceeded by land as far as Little Rock, where they were divided. The main party, including the women and children under conductor Vanderslice, were placed aboard a steamboat and delivered at Fort Coffee in February. The remainder with their chief Kinhi-Cha, their horses and oxen, conducted by Captain J.A. Phillips, went overland and reached Fort Coffee March 16. When Colonel Upshaw returned from Fort Coffee on his way to Memphis, he found 450 Chickasaw Indians at Helena, Arkansas, and he directed Mr. Crockett, who was returning from Fort Gibson after delivering his party of Creek Indians, to enroll the Chickasaw and conduct them to Fort Coffee. However, they refused to be enrolled and refused to have any whites with them. They said they were paying their own way, and they were determined to cross the Arkansas River at Arkansas Post. They intended to spend the winter in hunting, take their own time about traveling, and reach Fort Towson in the summer. Upshaw was therefore forced to leave them to their own plans. Still another party of nearly 200 who had been loitering on the way for some months, arrived near Little Rock late in May, crossed there and proceeded to Fort Towson. Altogether nearly 1,000 Chickasaw traveled to their new home without assistance or direction by the government. They were arriving in small parties from time to time through the winter and spring, having been compelled by sickness and cold weather to stop and camp for a considerable time along the road. Among these Col. George Colbert at his own expense removed a number of people and their slaves, who arrived early in the winter. Another party of 171 was removed by Pittman Colbert Arid located near Dokesville. It included James McCoy, Edmund Perry, John Creval, Daniel Harris, Mesho Hago, Anderson Frazier, Adams Perry, Pakapachi, Ishtufalachi, Cooper, Captain Mehta, Robert Colbert, and others with their families and slaves. 16 arrived at Fort Coffee on the steamboat Liverpool and 20 on the Itasca in May, 1838, and a little later a party of 150 who were paying their own expenses on the route. A picture of the Chickasaw removal is furnished by Colonel Upshaw. As for the expense of moving the will be fully made known to them by the Adhoctaws, many of whom appeared anxious that the emigrants might be induced to stop among them, and at places and under circumstances, that would give them an opportunity of preying upon their necessities. January 2 Colonel Upshaw had delivered to Captain G. P. Kingsbury at Fort Coffee 3,538 Chickasaw emigrants, and more were coming. They had a great amount of agricultural implements and baggage and were supplied with good tents. Before that time the Chickasaw who were in camp became restless for some settled plan to get them to their future home, and they were extremely anxious to have a road made, so that they could remove in time to prepare the ground for a crop of grain to sustain them the following year. Accordingly, 4 men selected by the Chickasaw registered accompanied Captain Kingsbury from Fort Coffee on December 21, 1837 to mark out a road. They followed the road leading to Fort Towson for about 25 miles, then took a turn to the right and proceeded for 25 miles to the second branch of the Forchmaline River, then 12 miles to Gaines Creek, 20 miles farther to Brushy Creek, from there 25 miles to Little Boggy Creek, and 12 miles farther to Clear Boggy Creek. They found an abundance of cane on all the creeks crossed, to sustain their stock while on the move, but there was very little cane on Blue River. Upon consent or otherwise to cease operating the mines, much disorder in the gold district resulted, and the government sent troops to protect the Indians, but at the instance of the state authority withdrew the soldiers and yielded to the possession of the state. While President Jackson's bill for the removal of the Indians was pending, Gov. George R. Gilmer of Georgia sent to the President his 2 proclamations and demanded that the national government keep its promise contained in the Act of 1802, to remove the Indians from the state. He was seconded by Gov. William Carroll of Tennessee, who offered to attempt the bribery of some of the influential Indians to lend their support to the movement upon the passage of the bill. I cannot but hope that I can induce both the stopped in the vicinity of Dwight Mission to make their homes. The remainder traveling west over the military road dropped off from time to time at places that pleased them, the last stopping at the Illinois River, except Miller's immediate connections who settled near the bayou Menard a few miles southeast of Fort Gibson. At the time Harris left his people at Dwight Mission there had been 81 deaths, of which 50 were from cholera, among them since leaving the Tennessee River. Of the whole number of deaths 45 were of children under 10 years of age who died chiefly of the measles, dysenteries, worms, and the result of exposure, confinement, want of proper cleanliness, the river water and the neglect of parents. The season following was one of great mortality among the troops at the military posts and other white people, and of the members of Harris's party who reached their new home nearly one half died before the end of the year. Registered in commenting on the menace to the health and lives of the Indians involved in their removal, Harris wrote, "Any of them had been reared from the cradle in easy circumstances. Copyright had enjoyed through life its comforts and some of its luxuries, and there were those too of more frugal, but still sufficient means, and those again who from childhood had been pressed by the gripping hand of poverty. That such a heterogeneous mass accustomed to live apart in thinly scattered settlements, suddenly crowded together in camps, copyright afterwards in boats, some totally deprived of what habit had taught them to look upon as the necessaries of life, copyright others who had rarely known a season of plenty, deprived of exercise, breathing a confined and poisonous atmosphere and maintaining, as they ever will under like circumstances, a total disregard for personal cleanliness, should in a term of 60 days even, under the most favorable circumstances, generate a pestilence within itself would not be surprising. Harris arrived at Fort Gibson May 14 and after making his reports to the Western agent of the Cherokee, sick and exhausted, he descended the river to Little Rock where he completed his business with the commissary stationed there. On June 5, the river still being too low for navigation, he started on horseback to St. Louis. There was something heroic in the devoted, intelligent, and indefatigable attention of this officer to his Indian charges. He continued in the service of Indian removal until his death, which occurred May 18, 1837, at his home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. O.H.N. Rosers, John Drew, James Rogers, and Moses Smith of Arkansas went east and joined a delegation of Eastern Cherokee going to Washington, composed of Andrew Ross, John West, James Starr, and T.F. Pack. The Western delegates carried a petition addressed by them and some of the Creek chiefs to the Secretary of War asking for the establishment of a line of military posts to protect the immigrants from the wild Indians. They proposed to organize a party of 1,000 men to visit all the Western Indians from whom acts of hostility might be apprehended, to conciliate whom they wished to be furnished money with which to purchase presents for them. In Washington on June 19, 1834, John H. Eaton as commissioner on behalf of the United States negotiated with the Eastern delegation, a treaty by which they purported to cede to the United States all the Cherokee land in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama, and the Indians agreed to remove to the west. The SMAE consideration included allowances for rifles, blankets, and brass kettles, $10,000 a year for 10 years for schools, $25,000 for the erection of schoolhouses, plows, axes, hoes, looms and wheels. Provision was made also for purchasing for the Cherokee 800,000 acres more land adjoining their holdings on the north, excepting that owned by the Seneca, Shawnee, and Quapaw, but it was provided that these tribes might become members of the Cherokee Nation if they wished and merge their lands with those of the Cherokee. A supplement provided that the Cherokee might negotiate with the Osage for part of their holdings west as far as McCoy's habitable line. The treaty also suspended the law which prevented them taking into their country for their own use such liquors as they desired. It provided compensation for the seizure 2 years before by Captain Vashon and Major Armstrong of a quantity of liquor imported by some of the Cherokee chiefs, an act which had produced much ill feeling on their part. This treaty was never ratified. For his participation in this business, Andrew Ross's life was threatened in August on his return to the Cherokee Nation. Later in the month a meeting was called by John Ross at Red Clay, Tennessee, not far from the present Chattanooga. John Walker, who had been very active in promoting the views of the government in favor of removal, was present, and on his departure was waylaid along the road, shot, and killed. This killing caused great excitement. 2 rival delegations from the Eastern Cherokee arrived in Washington in February, 1835, that of the National Party, headed by John Ross *, came prepared to fight to the end for home and national existence. The other, headed by Maj. John Ridge, a prominent sub-chief, despairing of successful resistance, was prepared to negotiate for removal. Reverend J. F. Schermerhorn, who was appointed commissioner for the purpose, negotiated a treaty with the Ridge Party to be confirmed later by the Cherokee people in General Council. It provided that the tribe was to cede its whole eastern territory and remove to the west in consideration of the sum of $3,250,000. The Ross Party insisted on having $20 million for its land, and the price in the Ridge Treaty was advanced to $4,500,000. The treaty was signed March 14, 1835, with the understanding that it was to be ratified by the tribe in full council before it became effective. Armed with the address from President Jackson, Schermerhorn spent the summer and autumn in fruitless attempts to secure the ratification of the treaty. Failing in these efforts, he asked permission to offer bribes to the leading members of the tribe, but Lewis Cass, Secretary of War, sternly denied his request. In October, the Cherokee tribe was called to meet in full council at Red Clay, Tennessee, to consider the treaty. John Howard Payne, who had just arrived at the home of John Ross nearby, describes the preparation for the meeting. "Mr. Ross received me with cordiality. He said he regretted that he had only a log cabin of but one room to invite me to. The winter before, while Ross was in Washington, his beautiful home in Georgia on the Coosa River was drawn in the Georgia lottery, and the evicted family retired across the line into Tennessee. With internal dissensions attempted to be fomented by the agents of government, and with incessant external attacks from Georgia, and not only undefended by their legitimate protector, the United States, but threatened by the N family, Taylor himself being very sick, with instructions to overtake the party, passed through Jackson, Tulow, halted and encamped at Widow Roberts on the road via Farmington. A considerable number drunk last night obtained liquor at Farmington yesterday, had to get out of bed about midnight to quell the disorder, a refusal by several to march this morning. However, they continued and passed through Caledonia, and the next day passed through the lead mines or Courtois diggings, halted at Scott's, where they remained another day to repair wagons, shoe horses and wash, and where Starr, Reese, and Taylor caught up with them. By the time the emigrants had crossed the Mississippi River, much sickness had developed among them from the unwholesome stagnant water in Illinois and their intemperate consumption of grapes along the route, which brought on violent attacks of dysentery. Nearly all the drivers were ill, some were left on the road, and substitutes hired. Finally, when 60 of the emigrants became too ill to travel, the physician with the party, G.S. Townsend, on the 25th called a halt. The party went into camp, and the conductor obtained permission for as many as could enter, to occupy a schoolhouse near a spring 2 miles farther along. The doctor treated them here for about 10 days, during which 4 persons died, 2 children of Corn Tassel and Olanhetta, George Killian, and a wagoner, a black boy. After the illness had abated somewhat, they got under way again December 4th, though there was not room in the wagons for all the ill. On the 5th they camped at the Merrimack River, and passed Massey's Iron Works the next day. On the 7th Reese's team ran away, broke his wagon and Starr's carryall, left him and family to get his wagon mended, and to overtake us if possible. The next day they buried Nancy Big Bear's grandchild. It rained all day, and at night several Indians were drunk. On the 9th Mayfield's wagon broke down at about a mile, left him to get it mended and overtake, halted at Waynesville. They camped at the Gasconade River on the 10th, next at Summers, then Mr. Parks, Eddington's on the 13th, and reached the James Fork of White River December 14th. December 15th, 183-7 James Starr's wife had a child last night. Wagoners, having horses shod until late at night, encamped and issued fodder and beef. They passed through Springfield, Missouri on the 16th and buried Elijah's wife and Ches, Timberlake's son. It was now snowing, much colder, and sickness was increasing. Buried Dreadful Waters this evening. They remained in camp at Dye's several days to attend the ill and wait for medicines to be brought from Springfield. On the 21st they reached Locks on Flat Creek. The next day buried Goddard's grandchild. On the 23rd buried Rainfrog's daughter, and halted at Reddick's. 3 days later they camped at James Coulter's on Cane Hill, Ark, and the next day buried Alcee Timberlake, daughter of Ches Timberlake. Marched at 8:00 a.m. halted at Mr. Bean's in the Cherokee Nation West. Having crossed the line, the exhausted party refused to advance farther and went into camp to minister to their sick. Buried another child of Ches Timberlake's, and one which was born yesterday, of which no other account than this is taken. Jesse Halfbreed's wife had a child last night. 2 days later, on December 30th, Canon Remus tiered his party and turned them over to Lieutenant Van Horn. 15 deaths had occurred on the march, 11 of children, 8 of them under 2 years of age. In spite of threats of arrest and punishment, Ross still continued active effort in behalf of his people. In the spring of 1838, 2 months before the time fixed for the removal, he presented to Congresses another protest and memorial, dated February 22, and signed by 15,665 Cherokee, which, like the others, was tabled by the Senate. That the so-called treaty was nothing more than a transparent fraud upon the Indians had become notorious. The Indians implored the administration not to take their statement of the facts, but to make an investigation and ascertain the truth of their contention. The President and Secretary of War were adamant. They answered merely that the treaty had been ratified by the Senate and that it was therefore beyond their powers to question it. And when reminded that under similar circumstances President Adams had refused to proceed under the fraudulent treaty with the Creeks negotiated in 1825 by government officials, and promptly had set it aside as a nullity, they were unmoved. In the crisis of affairs the President was willing to avail himself of the expedient presented by the Schermerhorn paper, shabby and venal as it was, to get the Indians out of Georgia for the benefit of white and red. Martin Van Buren had now succeeded Jackson as president and was disposed to allow the Cherokee a longer time to prepare for emigration, but was met by the declaration from Governor Gilmer of Georgia that any delay would be a violation of the rights of that state and in opposition to the rights of the owners of the soil, and that if trouble came from any protection afforded by the government troops to the Cherokee, a direct collision must ensue between the authorities of the state and federal government. Registered May 23, 1838, had been fixed as the time after which those who refused to leave voluntarily would be removed by force. But such was their love for their native land and their dread of removal, because of the accounts they had heard of deaths on the journey and in the new home provided for them, that few would consent to leave. Large keel boats had been constructed and were waiting at the bank near the Cherokee Agency to carry the emigrants down the Tennessee River as far as the Suck. These boats were 130 feet in length, with a house 100 feet long, 20 wide, 2 stories high, banistered around the top. They were made with partitions on each floor, making 4 rooms 50 by 20 feet furnished with windows. They were provided with stoves inside and 5 hearths on top of each boat for cooking. Gen. Nathaniel Smith of Athens, Tennessee, had been appointed superintendent of removal to succeed B. F. Curry, who died December 16, 1836. Smith planned to start another party and about 300 gathered near the agency, but the number dwindled to 250 and in spite of warnings and threats, by March 25, 1838, only these few Indians could be induced voluntarily to leave for Waterloo. There they were embarked aboard the smelter and a keel boat in tow, leaving on April 5 in charge of Lieutenant Edward Diaz. Registered the boats reached Paducah the second day and were anchored out in the river to prevent white people from introducing whiskey among the Indians. When they resumed their journey in the evening, the waves from the Ohio River washed in the keel boat and the terrified Indians, thinking it was sinking, rushed aboard the steamboat. As they could not be induced to return to the keel boat, it was discarded and the emigrants were all carried on the smelter. After a short stop at Memphis to secure supplies and stopping once to wood, they reached Montgomery's Point on the afternoon of the 9th. Securing a pilot for the Arkansas River, they passed through the cutoff, proceeded up the river, and reached Little Rock on the morning of the 11th. The river had fallen so low that it was impossible for the smelter to ascend higher, and Lieutenant Diaz secured passage for his people aboard the Little Rock, a steamboat of lighter draft that was on the point of setting out for the upper posts. The captain agreed to take the present party as far up as possible for $5 each for the whole distance and proportionately for a less. The smelter then proceeded up the river 5 miles and the passengers were landed for the night. The next day Captain Pennewood brought up his boat, the Little Rock, and the Indians were loaded on her and a keel boat in tow. He was towing another keel boat loaded with freight which sprung a leak, and the captain found it necessary to run ashore to prevent it from sinking. This boat was then abandoned, and after some delay the steamboat and one tow proceeded, arriving at the Lewiston Bar on the afternoon of the 14th. A week was consumed in the most laborious efforts to cross a succession of bars, during which the Indians were obliged several times to land and walk, and finally, it appearing that the boats would be unable to reach the Cherokee country on the existing stage of water, They were all landed at McLean's about 45 miles below Fort Smith. Here Diaz secured 16 wagons drawn by oxen and one by 4 horses. After loading in the wagons the personal effects of the Indians, the party started on the 24th. 2 days later 2 small children died. The party reached Fort Smith on the 28th and ferried the Arkansas River to the Cherokee country. After traveling 25 miles farther they arrived at McCoy's on Salisaw Creek, where they wanted to settle. The only source of annoyance upon the journey, said Diaz, has resulted from the people obtaining liquor, the use of which with Indians, as far as I have observed, results in rioting, fighting, or disorder of some kind. The infamous traffic of whiskey with Indians is carried on to a greater extent at Fort Smith than at any place I have seen. As far as I have observed, there is never any difficulty in managing Indians when sober, provided they are properly treated, but when under the effects of liquor they are unmanageable. In spite of the pressure upon the Indians, only about 2,000 of the eastern Cherokee had removed by May 23, 1838, the expiration of the time fixed for their departure. 1. The remaining nearly 15,000 could not believe that they would soon be driven out of the country, not from a fatuous reliance on the ultimate rectitude of the government, they had no such illusion. But their fixed habits, devoted attachment to their homes, and their unfamiliarity with any other life and country prevented their comprehension of what was soon to happen to them. Their enforced removal was entrusted to Gen. Winfield Scott, who was ordered to take command of the troops already in the Cherokee country, together with reinforcements of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, with authority to call upon the governors of the adjoining states for as many as 4,000 militia and volunteers. The total so employed was 7,000. The Indians had already been disarmed by General Wool. General Scott established headquarters at New Echota, the capital of the Cherokee Nation, whence, on May 10, he issued a proclamation to the Cherokee people, warning them that the emigration must begin at once and in haste, and that before another moon had passed every Cherokee man, woman, and child must be in motion towards the west as commanded by the President, whose orders he, General Scott, had come to enforce. The proclamation concludes, "Early troops already occupy many positions, and thousands are approaching from every quarter to render assistance and escape alike hopeless. Will you, then, by resistance compel us to resort to arms? Or will you by flight seek to hide yourself in mountains and forests and thus oblige us to hunt you down?" Reminding them that pursuit might result in conflict and bloodshed, ending in a general war. Even after this Ross endeavored, on behalf of his people, to secure some slight modification of the terms of the treaty, but without avail. The history of this at Cherokee removal of 1838, as gleaned by the author from the lips of actors in the tragedy, may well exceed in weight of grief and pathos any other passage in American history. Even the much-sung exile of the Acadians falls far behind it in its sum of death and misery. Under Scott's orders the troops were disposed at various points throughout. The officer in command treats his prisoners with great respect and indulgence. But fault lies somewhere. They are prisoners, without a crime to justify the fact. These savages, prisoners of Christians, are now all hands busy, some cutting and some carrying posts and plates and rafters, some digging holes for posts, and some preparing seats for a temporary place for preaching tomorrow. The principal. They were guarded to the river and back. Some whites present affirm it to have been the most solemn and impressive religious service they ever witnessed. Registered William Shorey Couday was present at one of the concentration camps as the Indians prepared to march to the rendezvous where they were to organize for their departure. He wrote his friend John Howard Payne what he saw there. At noon all was in readiness for moving. The teams were stretched out in a line along the road through a heavy forest, groups of persons formed about each wagon, others shaking the hand of some sick friend or relative who would be left behind. The temporary camp, covered with boards and some of bark that for 3 summer months had been their only shelter and home, were crackling and falling under a blazing flame. The day was bright and beautiful, but a gloomy thoughtfulness was depicted in the lineaments of every face. In all the bustle of preparation there was a silence and stillness of the voice that betrayed the sadness of the heart. At length the word was given to move on. I glanced along the line, and the form of Going Snake, an aged and respected chief whose head 80 summers had whitened, mounted on his favorite pony, passed before me and led the way in silence, followed by a number of younger men on horseback. At this very moment a low sound of distant thunder fell upon my ear in almost an exact western direction. A dark spiral cloud was rising above the horizon and sent forth a murmur I almost thought a voice of divine indignation for the wrong of my poor and unhappy countrymen, driven by brutal power from all they loved and cherished in the land of their fathers to gratify the cravings of avarice. The sun was unclouded, no rain fell, the thunder rolled away and seemed hushed in the distance. The scene around and before me, and in the elements above, was peculiarly impressive and singular. When nearly 17,000 Cherokee thus had been gathered into the various stockades, the work of enforced removal west began. Registered early in June, companies aggregating about 5,000 persons were brought down by the troops. Registered part were taken to the old agency, on Hiwassee River, at the present Calhoun, Tennessee, and Ross's Landing, and Gunter's Landing, lower down the Tennessee River, to be embarked upon boats. 2,800 of them were divided into 3 detachments, each accompanied by a military officer, a corps of assistants and 2 physicians. The first, with about 800 in the party, departed June 6, the next with 875 started on the 15th. The first party, forcibly placed on the boats, was in charge of Lieutenant Edward Diaz and was made up of Cherokee Indians from Georgia who had been concentrated at Ross's Landing. They were escorted by soldier guards aboard a little flotilla consisting of 1 steamboat of 100 tons, and 6 flatboats, one of which was constructed with a double-decked cabin. In the excitement and bitterness accompanying the enforced embarking of the Indians and their crowded condition aboard the boats, the conductors thought it best not to attempt to muster and count them until later. The boats were lashed together, 3 on each side of the steamboat, and left from Ross's Landing about noon on June 6. They made 4 or 5 miles an hour until their arrival at a series of dangerous rapids called the Suck, Boiling Pot, the Skillet, and the Frying Pan. The Suck is first and most difficult and dangerous of the rapids. The river here becomes very narrow and swift, and the banks on either side are rocky and steep, it being the point at which the stream passes through a gorge in the mountains. The S-boat with 1 flat on each side passed through, the most of the people on board, but after getting through the most rapid water, it was found impossible to keep her in the channel, and in consequence was thrown upon the north bank with some violence, but luckily none of the people were injured, although one of the flats was a good deal smashed. The other 4 boats came through 2 by 2, and the party was encamped before dark, as it was too late in the day to reach the rapids in daylight. The boats succeeded without incident in passing through the remainder of the rapids and into smooth water by noon the next day. They ran all that day and night, passed Gunter's Landing at 9 o'clock, stopped once to wood, and at night landed 6 miles above Decatur, and such of the people as choose have gone ashore to sleep and cook. Starting early on the morning of the 9th, they reached Decatur at 6 o'clock to take the train to Tuscumbia, but were compelled to remain until the next day. Then the Indians and their baggage were transferred from the boats to the railroad cars. About 32 cars were necessary to transport the party, and no more could be employed for want of power in the locomotive engines. As the Indians were much crowded on the train, the 23 soldiers were discharged. The first detachment reached Tuscumbia at 3 o'clock and boarded the steamboat Smelter, which immediately set off for Waterloo at the foot of the rapids without awaiting for the train of cars with the remainder of the party. When the second party reached Tuscumbia, they went into camp a while awaiting transportation by water. As the guard had been discharged, whiskey was introduced among them, much drunkenness resulting, and over 100 of the emigrants escaped. The remainder were carried by water aboard a keel boat and a small steamer about 30 miles to Waterloo. Here the party was united and set out on the 11th aboard the steamboat Smelter and 2 large double-decked keel boats. The next afternoon they reached Paducah, Kentucky, where Lieutenant Diaz left one of the keel boats which he found superfluous. He succeeded in mustering the Indians after a fashion and found that he had 489. The nights were clear and calm, and the boats ran both day and night, stopping only at intervals to wood. They passed Memphis in the evening of the 13th and arrived at Montgomery's Point at the mouth of White River the next afternoon. Securing a pilot here, they passed through the cut-off and entered Arkansas River, and, after ascending 70 miles, tied up at the bank while the emigrants went on shore to relax and encamp for the night. There were too many snags and sandbars in the Arkansas River to permit their running at night. This program was repeated each evening and they did not reach Little Rock until the 17th. Here Diaz dropped the other keel boat to enable the steamboat to make better speed and reached Fort Smith and Fort Coffee on the 19th. The boat was tied up at the north bank of the river near the mouth of Salisaw Creek. When the emigrants went ashore to spend the night, they found many of their friends who came to greet them and urged the emigrants to stop there and not continue up to Fort Gibson. After counseling together, they decided to follow this advice. They took their baggage off the boat and concluded to cast their fortunes in this district with their friends who had preceded them to the west. After their arrival at Fort Coffee, Diaz issued a sufficient quantity of N1 berth, were detained 3 hours wooding camped on the bank of Tennessee River at 6 p.a.c. The hours of stopping and starting were so arranged as to give the Indians sufficient time to cook in the evenings and mornings the provision for the day. On the 20th they arrived at Decatur and the next morning departed on 2 trains, arriving at the boat landing below Tuscumbia in the evening. One old woman died at Decatur and a man was killed by the cars when he attempted to rescue his hat. Before reaching Decatur, 25 Indians had escaped from the party. The emigrants were required to remain at Tuscumbia several days before boats could be secured to carry them over Coal Bear Shoals, and during their stay 2 children died. They passed the shoals on the 28th and encamped opposite Waterloo, Alabama, while awaiting the arrival of the steamboat Smelter. During the stay here, 3 children died, there was 1 birth, and 118 Indians escaped. The emigrants departed from Waterloo the last day of the month on the steamboat Smelter and 1 keel boat in tow. The next day another child died before the party arrived at Paducah. Stops were made to take on wood, to escape a windstorm, and to obtain supplies at Memphis, and on the 4th of July the boats entered the Arkansas River by way of the White River cut-off. 2 children died this day and 1 child the next. On arrival at Little Rock the emigrants were transferred to the steamboat Tecumseh of lighter draft in order to navigate higher up the river. They left on the 12th but were unable to ascend higher than Lewisburg, where the boat grounded on Benson's Bar. Here, after scouring the country, 23 wagons were secured to haul the sick people, principally children, and they departed on the 20th, leaving 80 ill in camp. The next day more wagons were secured and the remainder of the party took up the march. The weather was extremely hot, a drought had prevailed for months, water was scarce, suffocating clouds of dust stirred up by oxen and wagons, and the rough and rocky roads made the condition of the sick occupants of the wagons miserable indeed. 3 FOT, and 5 deaths occurred each day. To avoid the heat the marches were started before sunrise and ended at noon. Before the end of the month there were between 200 and 300 ill. On August 1st they were in camp at Lee's Creek. Did not move this day, the party requiring rest and being more than 1/2 sick. Notwithstanding every effort was used, it was impossible to prevent their eating quantities of green peaches and corn. Consequently the flux raged among them and carried off some days as high as 6 and 7. 4 days later these miserable beings entered the Cherokee Nation and went into camp near the head of Lee's Creek. Here they were delivered to Captain Stevenson, 602 of the original party, 70 having died in exactly 3 weeks. Among the recent immigrants, wrote Mr. Washburn at Dwight, on July 31, there has been much sickness, and in some neighborhoods the mortality has been great. Just returned from a neighborhood about 10 miles from the mission where there have been 14 deaths within 3 weeks. Want of medical aid. Since last October about 2,000 immigrants have come. 2,500 more are on their way. Much sickness and mortality among them. One company of these, originally 1,000, but diminishing by some hundreds, is expected to arrive today. Expected that nearly all will settle within 10 miles of this station. Asterisk a picture of Indian desolation in Georgia was sketched by the exulting Gen. Charles Floyd, militia officer in charge of operations against the Cherokee in that state, in his report to Governor Gilmer. Headquarters, Whittle Military District, New Dakota, June 18, 1838. Sir, I have the pleasure to inform your Excellency that I am now fully convinced there is not an Indian within the limits of my command, except a few in my possession, who will be sent to Ross Landing tomorrow. Wily scouting parties have scoured the whole country without seeing an Indian, or late Indian signs. If there are any stragglers in Georgia, they must be in Union and Gilmer counties, and near the Tennessee and North Ferry, a short distance above Jolly's Island, at the mouth of Hiwassee. Thence the route lay south of Pikesville, through ATC Minville, and on to Nashville, where the Umberland was crossed. The contingent of 1,103 Cherokee in charge of John Benj was the first to begin their journey, starting on October 1, 1838. Elijah Hicks's party of 748 started 3 days later and on the 16th reached Nashville, near where they camped for several days. There they were reported as suffering sorely for the want of clothing, and it was thought that scores of them must inevitably fall the victims of disease and death before reaching the far place of their destination. Indeed, when they passed through Nashville, 40 or 50 were on the sick list, and 4 or 5 were afterward buried near the city. 8. On the 24th Hicks, the first to reach there, reported from Port Royal near the Kentucky line, the people are very loath to go on, and unusually slow in preparing for starting each morning. I am not surprised at this, because they are moving not from choice to an unknown region not desired by them. I am disposed to make full allowance for their unhappy movement. The venerable Chief Whitepath has been in the last stages of sickness for many days and has to be hauled, and is helpless, who cannot last but a few days. Nokowe has given himself up to the bane of death, and I have altogether lost his services. Our police has to drive him along the road, sometimes fettered. A few days later, near Hopkinsville, Kentucky, Whitepath succumbed to sickness, infirmity, and the hardships of the forced journey, and died at the age of 75. He was interred near the Nashville road, and a monument of wood painted to resemble marble was erected to his memory. A tall pole with a flag of white linen flying at the top was erected at his grave to note the spot for his countrymen who were following. Registered, this party reached their destination on January 4, 1839, the first to arrive in their western home. 9 contingents left at intervals through October, and 4 during the next month. John Ross remained behind to supervise the preparations, and he was the recipient of numerous reports of progress and requests for advice. Wilson Lumpkin of Georgia and John Kennedy of Tennessee were appointed commissioners to supervise and carry into effect the provisions of the treaty preparatory to the removal of the Indians. Their duties required them to examine and pass on the claims of the Indians for loss and damage to their property in connection with the removal, as well as claims of the whites against them. The Indians who departed more or less voluntarily had the benefit of greater indulgence and leisure on the part of the commissioners than fell to the lot of the more than 13,000 who would not consent to leave until the last moment, as it was manifestly impossible to give them more than perfunctory attention before their departure. The commissioners proceeded to hear and determine them after the Indians had gone. As these Indians now on the way were driven from their home without either their property or compensation for its loss, their bitterness of spirit was greatly aggravated. At McMinnville, Tennessee, Rev. Jesse Bushyhead's party held a council and sent a message to Ross saying they had been compelled to leave without satisfaction of their claims, and they feared fraudulent demands would be made to defeat them, and they urged that no further consideration of them be had while the Indians were denied the opportunity of being present or represented. The party in charge of Rev. Evan Jones, a Baptist missionary, traveled 16 miles on October 16, but the people were so fatigued with the effort, that they remained in camp at McMinnville several days to rest. They paid $40 at the Walled Earns Ridge toll gate, and the man agreed to let the other detachments pass at half price, viz., 37 1 to 2 cents for 4-wheeled carriages and 6 1 to 2 for a horse. On the Cumberland Mountains they fleeced us, 73 cents a wagon and 12 1 to 2 cents a horse without the least abatement or thanks. Rev. Jesse Bushyhead's detachment was delayed by their oxen eating poison ivy and they were passed by Jones. Bushyhead that's had a distressing time with the discontents. Bushyhead reported from his party on October 31st, "We have a large number of sick and very many extremely aged and infirm persons in our detachment that must of necessity be conveyed in wagons. Our detachment now consists of about 978 or 79 Cherokees and there are 49 wagons and they would be unable to haul the corn needed for the horses. They often found it necessary to double the teams in ascending the mountain roads. The route carried all the emigrants through Nashville where the contractors furnished them with supplies. In November it rained excessively and the roads, cut up by thousands of horses, cattle, and people and hundreds of wagons and carts, became an appalling morass through which locomotion was accomplished with great difficulty and distress. The infirm and sick suffered in the wagons and carts that pitched and jolted behind the struggling oxen and horses, and they were obliged to await until stops were made at night for the attention of their physicians, who, tired after a day of travel, spent most of the night making brief calls upon the large number of patients. After the Indians left those who had driven them from their homes, they found the white people sympathetic with them in their distress, and as the 3rd Detachment of about 1,200 camped near Hopkinsville, Kentucky, on November 13, the citizens made generous donations for their comfort. The last party conducted by George Hicks did not start until November 4. Hicks sorrowfully reported that day to Chief Ross, "We are now about to take our final leave and kind farewell to our native land, the country that the Great Spirit gave our fathers. We are on the eve of leaving that country that gave us birth. It is with sorrow that we are forced by the authority of the white man to quit the scenes of our childhood. We bid a final farewell to it and all we hold dear. From the little trial we have made in a start to move, we know that it is a laborious undertaking, but with firm resolution we think we will be able to accomplish it, if the white citizens will permit us. But since we have been on our march many of us have been stopped and our horses taken from our teams for the payment of unjust copyright past demands, yet the government says we must go, and its citizens say you must pay me, and if the debtor has not the means, the property of his next friend is levied on and yet the government has not given us our spoliation as promised, our property has been stolen and robbed from us by white men and no means given us to pay our debts. You will read the history of this unfortunate band, reduced by disease and accident from some 450, to scarce more than 300 strong of their losses, their privations, their dangers, trials, troubles. Objects of the suspicion and hatred for more than a year past, of their fellow countrymen, most of them have led a wandering and anxious life, many of them driven from their homes. Their cabins burned, their property destroyed or driven away, their aged and their infirm made martyrs to their faith by the exposure, fatigue, copyright, privation of the wretched condition to which they were reduced themselves, alternately assailed by the persecutions, temptations, promises, copyright threats of our enemies, and finally, pursued and persecuted, their numbers fearfully thinned and many of the most loved and venerated laid cold by a cruel disease on their long and copyright tedious journey to a distant and unknown land. Halatai Marthla, a name that will never be breathed by those who knew him but with respect and love, a name which, had his destiny lain in a more favorable path, might have shown amongst those of the greatest copyright the best of the age in which he lived, their venerated chief, their father, guardian, friend, he who had been their prop and stay through the trials and afflictions of the past, copyright who was the anchor of all their future hopes, he too has been taken from them. The bones of the aged warrior repose in peace upon the banks of the Arkansas, copyright, in the language. J. 340. Of an eyewitness, his disconsolate and broken-hearted people mourn over his loss at length in their too dearly found homes. Our country owes to his memory a debt of gratitude liberally should it be paid to his bereft family and to his afflicted people. Instances of such integrity as his are rare indeed. His was the directing and controlling spirit that guided this little band along its mazy path, his the hand that bound them with the friendly tie copyright and which watchfully held each link together, and his the heart at which the deadliest shafts were levelled. His virtues would have honored the patriot and the sage, and long and reverently should his name be cherished. How great must have been the fortitude which enabled these people to resist the many temptations which assailed them to abandon our cause, a cause at one time apparently to them so hopeless, and which exposed them to such imminent dangers, copyright inconveniences both present and prospectively, until they or their countrymen in arms should be annihilated. Registered. More aggressive campaign was inaugurated by General Jessup during the following autumn and winter. Several thousand troops scoured deep in the Indian country, burning towns and destroying the stores of kunti root of which the Indians made bread, killing hundreds of the cattle on which they subsisted, and capturing other hundreds of cattle and their ponies, the latter in many cases loaded with packs containing the sole possessions of these people, men, women, and children, now living like hunted animals, prepared to flee at a moment's notice, occasionally encountering small parties of the elusive enemy, a few score of whom were killed or taken prisoners. In these engagements the Indians and their allies fought with such bravery and coolness as to challenge the admiration and evoke tributes from the white soldiers and their officers. At one little encampment the Indians took the alarm and plunged into a thick growth of palmettos and small trees immediately beyond their camp. The more advanced men of the party fired upon the Indians as they fled, and, it is thought, wounded one warrior. At the camp were found 3 pots of kunti and cabbage boiling on the fire, wooden spoons lying by, in a small wooden bowl, indicating preparations for a meal. A rifle, a bow and arrows, 2 shot pouches, and powder horns, a tomahawk, 2 axes, scalping knives, blankets, skins, besides several ornamental trinkets of silver and beads, etc., etc., were picked up in the camp, besides a large supply of kunti which was lying in a heap near the fire. Thus it is. The poor devils are driven into the swamps and must die next summer if not before, from the effects of being constantly in the damp, low, and foggy ground. And yet they will not go. There is a charm, a magic, in the land of one's birth. An army officer recorded in his journal in January, 1837. A scout of mounted men and Indians, under Lt. At O'Lonell Caulfield, was sent out in search of the enemy, and at about 1 p. to join the main body, having killed the chiefs at Oapur and Wea, claiming to represent Micanopy for Hulputa Hadjo. By the terms of this treaty the Indians agreed to cease their hostilities, come to Tampa Bay by April 10, and board the transports for the West. The chief Micanopy was to be surrendered as a hostage for the performance of their promises. However, to induce them to accept these terms, General Jessup was obliged to agree to the one condition that the Indians had insisted on from the beginning, and that was that their allies, the free Negroes, should also be secure in their persons and property, and that their Negroes, their bona fide property, shall accompany them to the West. Asterisk. Though this treaty was made with only a faction of the tribe, the war was again believed to be over. Micanopy came to Camp Dade March 18 and agreed to the treaty and said he was ready to go west. About 250 hostiles also assembled near the post prepared to emigrate. Osceola was not among them, however, having folded his arms and walked away. If only half that has been said of this indomitable warrior be true, he is a most remarkable man. The war is believed to have originated, and been carried on, mainly by his influence with the savage brethren, and yet he is now discarded from their councils because he would not embrue his hands in the blood of his captives. 7 Jumper, Abraham, Alligator, and Micanopy all came in. Alligator is a most sensible, shrewd, active, and jocose man, worth all the Indians I have seen. Jumper is in a decline from a pulmonary affection. He is a sensible man, but from the state of his health, and consequent low spirits, much disposed for peace. Abraham is a cunning Negro, of good consideration with the Seminoles, and who can do more than any other. Micanopy is not the fat old fool we thought him, but certainly possessing good sense, and actually exercising regal powers. He was respectable in appearance with the council, his remarks evincing judgment, and his deportment suitable and comporting with his nominal rank. Registered gradually through April, chiefs and sub-chiefs were bringing detachments of their people into Tampa Bay, among them was Kuokuki, the son of Philip, the principal chief on the St. John's River. His influence is greater than that of his father. Gen. Jessup states that he is the most talented man he has seen among the Seminoles, and will no doubt be the principal chief of the nation. Registered, the Indians were bringing in their cattle and horses to be purchased by the Quartermaster's Department of the Army. By the early part of May, Osceola and Philip with several hundred of their warriors on the way to Tampa Bay stopped near Fort Mellon to dispose of their cattle. It was observed here that the hardships of the war had been felt most by the women, who seemed in a most depressed condition. They are the most destitute-looking beings we have yet seen. Most of them are almost naked. They are a fine hardy-looking set of fellows, and none look the worse for wear, except in dress. It would be difficult to starve them out. They came in with loads of kunti root, all prepared for making bread. Asterisk. The Indians were congregating in 2 large camps in the vicinity of Tampa Bay, where they waited in a tentative spirit to test the good faith of the whites, of whom they were suspicious. Parties visit the post to satisfy themselves of the sincerity of our troops, and being satisfied, go out to report to others. They draw rations, and procure articles of clothing. They say that their women and children are naked, and that they cannot bring them in till they have clothing for them, and that they are busy making up the materials they obtain in articles of dress. The Indians were as suspicious of the motives and intentions of the whites as the latter were of them. Everything depended on winning the confidence of the Indians until all should come in and board the transports. Capt. John Page, who was to have charge of the removal, remained in one of their camps to gain their confidence. They were long engaged in hunting and collecting their cattle in order to bring them in for sale before their departure, so that their arrival was delayed, and they begged that the time for taking the boats be extended to autumn. This was refused by General Jessup, but the long delay permitted the operation of sinister influences. White people honestly seeking the recovery of runaway Negroes, and other whites hoping to seize those to whom they had no claim, began clamoring for permission to enter the Seminole camps and settlements in quest of slaves. This was opposed to General Jessup's orders and would violate the express terms of the treaty under which the Indians came to Tampa Bay. Under the pressure of strong influence, however, Jessup modified his orders so that whites were permitted to go among the Indians. They naturally took alarm, and many of the Negroes hastily disappeared. They in turn were followed by bodies of Indians, and General Jessup regretfully reported that his hopes of ending the war and the peaceful removal of the Indians had given way to misgivings. Jessup then ordered the Indians present to be enrolled so that they could depart by June 15, but they objected, saying they could not be ready before autumn. Becoming suspicious, the general sent a detachment to their camp and learned that they had all left, including Micanopy and Jumper. However, an epidemic of measles in the camp, from which 20 had died, was one reason for their leaving. But they were charged with having outwitted General Jessup by obtaining government rations for several weeks and securing immunity from attacks by the troops while they raised crops and prepared for further resistance. It was discovered that Micanopy and Jumper had been kidnapped and carried off by Osceola and other hostiles. The troops could not operate against the Indians during the sickly summer season, and General Jessup employed the time preparing for an autumn campaign. The services of the Creeks had not been a great success, though near June 1, Paddy Carr and his band brought in 150 head of cattle and mules for sale, which they had captured from the Seminole. Paddy insisted that they were still at war and would on no account agree to leave the country. Nearly 3 weeks after the capture of Philip, his son Kuokuki came to St. Augustine under a flag of truce to consult his father about the future policy of his people. Wildcat expected to be permitted to return to his people, but instead he was imprisoned with his father. However, he was the next month released to carry messages to the Indians, who were thereby induced to send in a number of Negroes. Wildcat returned according to promise and was again locked up in the fort. For that which gave the greatest joy to the army officers was the capture of Osceola, resulting from Wildcat's visit. Expecting to be recalled from his command for his failure to conquer the Indians, public criticism and chagrin rested heavily on General Jessup, and he resorted to measures that he found it difficult to justify. The treaty made by him in March had been observed by the Indians as a treaty of peace. But there were points concerning their slaves and terms upon which removal was to proceed that were not understood by them. In response to messages carried by Wildcat, Osceola, and a party of his warriors, about October 20th, came to a point 7 or 8 miles from St. Augustine, whence they sent word to General Jessup that they desired a conference. The general did not meet them, but instead sent General Hernandez, who was directed first to charge Osceola with responsibility for failure to return stolen slaves according to the promise of an obscure chief with which Osceola had nothing to do, and then if his replies should not be satisfactory, as it was known in advance they would not be, to make that an excuse to seize him and his followers. After formal salutations a conference was begun, and while it was in progress under the direct orders of General Jessup a considerable force quietly surrounded the Indians and at a signal closed in and made them prisoners. Register General Jessup had been the object of bitter criticism from many quarters for his failure to conquer the Indians or to achieve even a slight advantage over them, and he felt that his violation of the trust implied by Osceola seeking a conference with him would be condoned by the country. But when it was known how he had taken the intrepid chief, condemnation was almost as bitter in its denunciation of the means employed as it had been of his former failure. Jessup then undertook to placate his critics by detailing facts about the affair as mitigating the violation of his obligation to a trusting foe. In some quarters his explanation was accepted and he was acquitted of wrongdoing for the reason, as one lame apologist said, however revolting the violation of a flag of truce may at first appear, yet when we reflect that the general was dealing with savages, who had once forfeited their plighted faith, and deceived him that the interview was sought by them, and probably with the worst of motives, it is believed that he will not only be justified by public opinion, on the expediency of the measure, but will be commended for it. On November 9 General Hernandez returned to St. Augustine with 53 Indians and 16 Negroes captured by him. 20 of them were warriors, including the eldest and youngest sons of King Philip. A general order was issued, heralding the success of the troops to all the posts on the east of St. John's. The Cherokee Indians were deeply immersed in their own difficulties with the government. They were so moved by the greater sufferings of the Seminole that their chief then in Washington consented to attempt a mediation between them and the United States. The undertaking had been proposed by John H. Sherburne, a special agent of the United States, whereupon the Cherokee chief, John Ross, named a delegation of Cherokee to go to Florida. Before entering upon their mission, however, Ross discussed the subject with the Secretary of War, who gave it his hearty approval. Ross then on October 18, 1837, indited a talk to the chiefs of the Seminole tribe, and this was conveyed by the Cherokee delegation consisting of Herr Conrad, Jesse Bushyhead, Thomas Woodward, Richard Fields, and the interpreter, Major Polecat. The Cherokee delegation proceeded from their nation to Augusta, Georgia, where they met Sherburne and with him on November 6 arrived at Charleston, whence they sailed. On their arrival in Florida they went to see General Jessup at his headquarters at Pico Lotta, and the next day proceeded to St. Augustine, where November 10, the delegation accompanied by the commander of the fort visited the Seminole prisoners confined there. Soon after, the whole procession, with the Cherokees in full costumes, arrived, and were formally introduced, by all shaking hands, etc. Benches were then brought in the great square of the fort, and the Seminole chiefs took their seats. The Cherokees sat facing them with Tustanugi, a Miccosukee chief, and other warriors came to Fort King for a conference. They were received by General Tuacombe with much form and ceremony, and with every mark of friendship and kindness. All of them were much embarrassed by the appearance of so many officers and soldiers in uniform, and it was not until they were told that they pertained to the rank of the Great River in a steamboat with a trader and a stock of goods to establish a trading post within the region reserved for the Indians. Before the establishment had been completed, before daylight on the morning of July 23, 1839, the company of 32 men were attacked by what were called Spanish Seminole *, who killed 18 of the party. The result was that General Macomb and his treaty came in for much criticism, but some of the leaders among the Indians hastened to report to the posts and disclaim any participation in the bloody affair. A week later, when 45 Indians visited Fort Mellon to receive rations, the officer in command made them all prisoners and took them on a steamboat to Fort Moultrie. Registered feudal scouting expeditions were continued through the summer, and in the autumn the yellow fever appeared in the country to make the labor of the troops more difficult and hazardous. Everybody was ill at Tampa Bay, and in St. Augustine not a physician was able to minister to the ill. During the year of his administration, 1839, Taylor undertook to traverse the country with roads and erect forts at strategic points, and by the end of the year 70 forts had been established. Some of these were merely stockades, but they bore testimony to the amazing tenacity and resourcefulness of the Indians, who made the efforts of the army almost futile. Through the whole summer the troops had discovered only a small part of the well-concealed fields of the Indians, and had destroyed 1,500 acres of their corn and pumpkins, and some 100 or 2 sheds were burnt. But so far from being induced to come in and surrender themselves to our arms, very few Indians were seen, and still less killed or captured. Registered every stream and lake and swamp abounded with good fish, game was plentiful, the kunti root for making their bread grew abundantly, and it was impossible to threaten the food supply of the Indians. The army had made such slight impression on them that the officers were in despair. The soldiers in their pale blue and white uniforms were conspicuous at a distance, while the Indians often concealed themselves by standing stock still in view of the enemy, their dark skin and soiled garments, if any, giving them the appearance of a stump. The campaign of 1839 failed so signally that the Governor and Council of Florida sent to Cuba and purchased 33 bloodhounds that had been employed in the pursuit of Negro slaves. When information of this new branch of the service against the Indians became known, indignant protests from over the country poured into Washington. The subject engaged the attention of Congress, and the Secretary of War sought to placate criticism by ordering that in the pursuit the dogs should not be allowed to attack the Indians. While General Taylor favored the use of the dogs, it was demonstrated that they were of little value. In preparation for the campaign of 1840, Capt. John Page prevailed on 2 of the principal Seminole chiefs, Halatoki and Nocosiola, 12 other Indian immigrants, and 2 interpreters to accompany him from Fort Gibson to Florida for the purpose of exerting their influence on the resident Indians to remove to the west. The parting from their families and friends on October 1, 1840, was an affecting scene. Halatoki and other chiefs made parting addresses, and the old chief Alligator, formerly one of the most uncompromising, as well as brave and successful among the emigrated Seminole warriors, then took the stand in behalf of the people, and in an animated strain, conjured the members of the deputation to neglect no effort with their suffering brethren to induce them to join the immigrants in the West. The party descended the Mississippi River and traveled from New Orleans aboard the ship Harbinger, arriving at Tampa Bay 1 month and 2 days after their departure from Fort Gibson. On this ship came also Major W. G. Belknap and 4 companies of the 3rd Infantry from Fort Smith. In October an expedition under Maj. Greenleaf Dearborn was ordered out. About 40 miles distant an old woman was met having 16 sticks in her hand. She asked for 16 days when some Indians would come in for a talk. The 16 days expired yesterday, and the squaw returned saying that 2 chiefs and 10 warriors were 8 miles distant waiting to see the general. This morning the General Armistead took a troop of dragoons and went out to hear what they had to say. 9 p.m. The general has returned after a 40-mile ride. He says he met Tiger Tail and Halek Tustanuggy. Copyright the warriors. Copyright that they say here comes the old story. He say him tired of the war, him want to fight no more. The Gen. says they seem to be really in earnest. They say their corn has been destroyed and their women are broke down with labor in preparing county road, that they are in a starving condition. Copyright can fight no longer, that the country is theirs. Copyright that we have no right to it, but that if we will not let them have a part of it, they must go. That they hope we will let them stay, but they will do as we say. The Gen. told them that he could give them no answer, but would write for instructions to Washington. In the meantime they have promised to come into Fort King with their families and to induce all of the others to come in. Whether this is to be a farce like all the other talks remains to be seen. Trademark escorted by Captain B.L.E. Bonneville, and his dragoons, General Armistead on November 7 joined the Arkansas delegation and a large number of troops near Fort King. Some of the Indians who came into the camp loaded with venison reported the approach of Halleck Tustenuggee and his band at Tampa Bay. They shook hands with the visiting delegation, some of them coldly, others with smiles of recognition. The principal men from Arkansas then commenced talking Euro and continued talking a long time. Gen. Walker K. Armistead with Col. William J. Worth and several other officers, escorted by a company of dragoons, went out to the camp of Halleck Tustenuggee for an interview on the subject of emigration. Colonel Worth thought there were 50 or 70 Indians about the place of meeting, which he describes as one of the most dense hammocks he has ever seen. Their rifles were laid upon logs, loaded and ready for use. Suspicion is the order of the day. They cheated Gen. Jessup, who took revenge by seizing a party under a flag of truce, and they are afraid of being taken now. The Indians thus far seen are well dressed. Some few are dressed entirely in deer skins, but some have cloth leggings and nearly all have calico shirts. We see but few blankets. There is so far as seen a full proportion of ornaments, beads and feathers. Tiger Tail sent word that he would be present for a talk with General Armistead, but suddenly on the night of the 14th the 200 Indians in the neighborhood suddenly disappeared and General Armistead was entirely subdued and broken-spirited. His confidence in his success had been boundless, and his letters to Washington have doubtless been in that temper. He was so exasperated that he gave orders for his troops to pursue the Indians, and in the event that any of them thereafter should present themselves with a flag of truce, they were at once to be made prisoners. The troops, however, were unable to overtake or discover any of them for some time. Registered, the hunt continued, and on March 21, 220 captive Tallahassee Indians were embarked from Tampa Bay for New Orleans. There on April 4 the party, reduced by death to 205 Indians and 6 Negroes, boarded the steamboat President in charge of Maj. William G. Belknap for the ascent of the Mississippi River. On the 19th they were landed on the Arkansas opposite the mouth of the Grand River. Wagons were provided and the emigrants were taken from here to join their chief Micanopy on the Deep Fork. Another party of 200 in charge of L.E. Capers, dispersing agent, left Tampa Bay on May 7 and reached New Orleans 6 days later. The emigrating agent was instructed to have them vaccinated and then permit them to see the city before sending them on, but he learned that there were lurking in the city a set of loafers from Georgia looking for Negroes they pretended to claim, when in fact they have no more legal claim than I have. For safety the agent kept the Indians in confinement and on the 16th embarked them on the steamer John Jay in charge of Capt. H. McCavitt, who landed them June 13 at the Choctaw Agency, whence they marched overland to their new home. Registered Alligator, Hotulka E. Mathla and Waxy E. Mathla in charge of Captain S. B. Thornton were employed to return to Florida and use their influence to secure more emigrants. 2 They descended the Arkansas River from Fort Gibson and on September 20, 1841, with 6 companies of the 4th Infantry in command of Col. John Garland, they departed from Fort Smith for Florida. Each of the Indian emissaries was permitted to take with him one other and an interpreter. In May Halleck Tustenuggee sent to the post at Tampa Bay 115 sticks to indicate that his band numbering that many people would come in and surrender. A number of Indians bearing a passport signed by Colonel Worth and accompanied by a Negro interpreter named Joe came into Fort Pierce and reported that Wildcat had sent them to say that he was ready to surrender if it was all right. Maj. Thomas Childs said it was all right and sent Lieutenant William Tecumseh Sherman with 8 or 10 mounted men to accompany Joe and 1 Indian to bring in the chief. 6 or 7 miles away they found a handsome young Indian of 25 years, and a dozen other warriors, and invited them to go to the fort. They had some little difficulty in persuading them to do so, but finally O'Cookie dressed himself in all his finery and went to the fort. There he said he was tired of the war and wanted to go with his people to the Indian Territory, but he wanted rations for a month, which time it would take to get his people together for the journey. This was agreed to, and then the great chief got gloriously drunk. A few days later he went away, but frequently sent back messengers for more whiskey and provisions. At the end of the month he was but little nearer ready to travel than before. A council was accordingly called, at which, O'Cookie became drunk again. Then Sherman and some of his men put the whole party in irons, and they were promptly shipped off to the Indian Territory. In all, several hundred Indians were captured and concentrated at Tampa Bay through the summer of 1841. 200 were started west, of whom 3 died on the way, and 197 were delivered at Fort Gibson November 12. Under the influence of Micanopy they agreed to remove from the vicinity of the post to the Deep Fork River, and had crossed the Arkansas when they were overtaken by a blizzard. These wretched half-clad Indians, who were unused to cold weather, huddled around campfires on the bank of the Arkansas River, where is now the Muskogee Water Works, and for some time refused to budge farther. The steamer Little Rock passed Little Rock early in November with 207 Seminole Indians, 60 of whom were warriors, besides women and children. They included Wildcat and Hospitake, and were in charge of Capt. Washington Sewell and Lieutenant Forbes Britton, detained by the low stage of the river. They did not reach Fort Gibson until near 2 months later. More Indians were captured during the next winter, and in the spring were transported to New Orleans in the brig Lawrence, Opaland. 300 of these left New Orleans aboard the steamer President in charge of Captain T.L. Alexander, but on May 1 their progress was interrupted 60 miles below Little Rock by the low stage of the Arkansas River. With an accession of water later in the month they reached Weber's Falls June 1. As the boat was unable to proceed farther, the Indians were put ashore and ordered to march to their new home on Deep Fork River and join the earlier arrivals. This they refused to do, and insisted on crossing the Arkansas River and proceeding to Fort Gibson to join the Seminole living there with Alligator, and it became necessary to order out 5 companies of troops from Fort Gibson to the mouth of the Illinois River to force the Indians across the Arkansas on the way to the Deep Fork. Registered another party of 100 under Lieutenant E.R. $8. Canby, that left New Orleans aboard the steamboat Swan July 22, was forced by low water to abandon the boat 6 miles below Little Rock and march overland by Fort Smith and the Choctaw Agency to the Creek Council ground, where they were delivered to the agent on September 6, 1842. General Taylor, then stationed at Fort Smith, estimated that by March 21, 1842, 2,833 Seminole Indians had been removed and located, 1,097 of Alligator's and Halatoki's bands from 9 to 15 miles north, and 70 of Wildcat's band 3 miles south of Fort Gibson. Micanopy's town, numbering 827 people 10 to 40 miles southwest, and Conc Hart Mico's band of 479 20 miles south of the fort. Black Dirt's band of 360 survivors were located on the Little River 90 miles southwest of the post. Point 2 registered some of the Seminole located on Cherokee land, planted crops there with the consent of the owners, and General Taylor gave them permission to remain until their crops were gathered. General Worth succeeded by an act of perfidy in seizing some Indians he had himself invited within his guards, and they were sent out of Florida, whereupon the end of the war was proclaimed, and through the influence of Gen. Scott, Worth was brevetted a brigadier general. Registered, but it was soon discovered that the war was not over. One of the chiefs of the Miccosukee, who it was supposed had surrendered, escaped with some of his companions, and on November 28, 1842, Col. Ethan Allen Hitchcock received an order to reopen the war which has been closed so often heretofore. I am to operate along the Apalachicola River? Hitchcock declined the offer of 2 companies of civilian volunteers he was authorized to accept, and with 2 companies of his regiment, the 3rd, on December 12, 1842, on the steamboat William Gaston, began the descent of the Apalachicola River in quest of Pascofa and his band of Ochlockonee Indians, the hostiles who yet stood in the way of peace in Florida. These were Creek Indians who fled from the terrors of Alabama in 1836 and took refuge in Florida. They had made their escape from the party of Creeks that emigrated from the Apalachicola in 1838, and since had been a scourge to the settlements on that river, killing the inhabitants and burning their buildings. For 4 years futile efforts had been made to capture them or bring them in by negotiation. By the exercise of patience and perseverance, Hitchcock succeeded through his messengers in bringing to his camp some members of Pascofa's party with assurances that the chief himself would visit the colonel in 3 days. There was some rivalry among the officers and detachments operating in Florida, and this news, which presaged a real ending of the war, was followed by demonstrations of joy by officers and soldiers comparable to the jubilation produced by an armistice between much greater forces. Pascofa appeared on the 17th and had a long talk with Colonel Hitchcock, whose honorable and sympathetic treatment of the Indians had won their trust and respect. Pascofa expressed his joy that peace was to be established between them and explained the ceremony he desired observed in celebrating that peace. As he is the last chief to give up, he said he would do something in especial. Of course I humored him and told him to do what he pleased. About 3 p.m. his warriors appeared. I had furnished him a horse in the morning, copyright the runner no cos, had another. These were on the lead, each horse carrying double, the remaining warriors being in Indian file on foot with feathers in their scalp locks, all singing a war song. When within some 100 or 200 yards they discharged their rifles and, continuing past my guard, entered the center of the amp, where I received them with my officers. Of course I gave them a talk after shaking hands all around. After the chief made his talk start, the liquor was brought by Lt. Henry, who handed me a tin cup filled with the most abominable stuff. I took the cup and, without blessing it, led off, to their good health, and handed it to the chief, who pronounced Ist Linus Cha and passed it on, all his warriors drinking Ist Linus Cha. The chief wanted a blanket, begged copyright plead for one, even an old horse blanket, if I could give him no other. He wanted it, he said, for his wife. He was ashamed to have her seen, as she was almost naked. His warriors are wretchedly dressed, mostly in skins, i.e. leggings, but with very dirty and tattered shirts. 1 or 2 had pieces of blankets about them. They were not all armed, and they told my interpreter that they generally hunted with the bow and arrow and could kill a deer with an arrow almost as certainly as with a ball. Registered the chief required 4 days' time to assemble his people and board Colonel Hitchcock's boat, and as he desired one big drunk and grand frolic for his people before leaving, he sent in a doeskin which Hitchcock filled with 5 gallons of liquor to meet his requirements. While waiting here, Colonel Hitchcock learned that Tiger Tail and his party had been taken to Cedar Keys under an escort of troops. Hitchcock's boat descended the river to the bay and then ascended the Ochlockonee River 30 miles to receive Pascofa's party. Their canoes being in bad condition, there was some delay and they did not reach the steamboat until January 9. When they boarded the boat they numbered 21 men, 19 women, and 10 children, and there was issued to each of them a blanket, to each man a shirt and turban, and to each woman a calico dress and a head kerchief. They then descended the river with much difficulty from snags and bars, and Hitchcock received accounts of the seizure at Tampa Bay of the party of Okaker, A. Reek, at Hife, who has been tampering with the authorities since last play or June. They were seized by order of Gen L. Worth by Cap Sewell of the 7th Infi. Sewell, it appears, invited them to receive presents copyright, and when assembled surrounded them and took them prisoners and sent them to Sea Horse Key, one of the, at Edar Keys. As Hitchcock's boat approached Port Leon yesterday morning about 9 o'clock, the Indians wished to give the war yell. I gave permission and it was done, but soon afterwards a revulsion of feeling seemed to overcome the whole of them, for on nearing the wharf and seeing the people, the Indians appeared to be struck with the conviction that they were now, indeed, in our power. The men became silent and serious, sad, while the women were nearly all in tears. I took occasion to speak to them, telling them not to lose heart, that they were among friends who would take care of them, that I was glad to see they had feeling hearts, but to make sure they would be treated well. The chief himself even was so affected that his lips trembled and he could not say a word. A story exists that in the early part of the war, the children of this band were put to death by their parents to prevent being discovered by their noise and to make themselves light for hasty retreats, and it is a fact that the children among them extend up from infancy to 4 years of age mostly to but 3 and then jump to 15 or 16. It would really seem from this that some 4 years ago they did put some of their children to death. Yesterday morning, just before leaving the boat, I had an opportunity of speaking to a very matronly looking woman, the mother of 2 grown women and an infant, the infant being in her arms, and I took the occasion, interpreter being by, to tell her that she would soon be happier than she had been. Copyright Yensi. Reminded her of their having lived more like wild animals than like human creatures, but that now they would begin to have houses and make gardens etc., and could bring up their children too. Something besides war. The old woman dropped her head and burst into tears. And now, after more than 6 years of cruel and futile fighting and killing, entailing the expenditure of the lives of 1,500 white soldiers and $20 millions, and untold suffering, misery, and mortality of the Indians in defense of their homeland, the Seminole War was actually terminated, and Colonel Hitchcock was credited with that bloodless achievement by his fellow officers, the press, and by Governor R.K. Call in a special message to the Florida legislature recommending a vote of thanks to him. For the steamer William Gaston with Pascofa's band on board departed for New Orleans but lost her rudder in a violent storm on January 20, and little hope for the vessel was entertained by her officers. However, by skillful handling she succeeded in reaching Pensacola, where a temporary rudder was rigged with which she made New Orleans some days later. Here the Indians were landed at the barracks and consolidated with earlier arrivals soon to ascend the Mississippi River. Registered. These Indians in charge of Lieutenant McCavitt left New Orleans March 4 and on the 11th reached Little Rock, where they were detained by low water. They were landed on the south bank of the Arkansas River opposite the mouth of the Illinois on April 26. From here they were taken overland to their agency. Making a virtue of the necessity, General Worth agreed that several hundred Seminole Indians might remain for the present in Florida upon conditions to which the Indians paid little attention. They continued to live immured in the fastnesses of Florida, but the government was not allowed by the white people to forget their presence. Through emissaries of their own tribe in 1849 large financial inducements were offered them to join their brothers in the West. They were promised $500 a head for each man and boy capable of bearing arms, and $100 for each woman or child. The government promised to subsist them for a year after their removal and to pay for all cattle, hogs, crops and other property abandoned or left behind, to make them presents of clothing and blankets before starting, to pay all expenses en route, and furnish a physician for the journey, and in addition large sums were offered by army officers to individual Indians of influence in the tribe, amounting in one case to $10,000. No such inducements were ever held out to any other tribe, but they failed to influence the Seminole Indians to leave their native land. These efforts were supplemented by a military force sent to overawe them, but the 400 or 500 Indians hidden in Florida refused to yield. In 1851 a commission was issued to Luther Blake to go to Florida and attempt their removal. He was authorized to offer $800 to each warrior and $450 for each woman and child who would agree to emigrate, but this effort also was fruitless. An abortive attempt was made in 1856 by Army officers at Fort Gibson to take a delegation of Indians to Florida for their influence on those remaining there, but the Indians convinced them that if the enterprise were directed by the military it was doomed to failure. In the winter of the next year Elias Rector, Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Southern Superintendency, S.M. Rutherford, the Western Seminole Agent, and W.H. Garrett, Creek Agent, took to Florida a delegation of 40 Seminole and 6 Creeks. At the cost of a large sum of money Rector engaged the services of a number of influential Florida Seminole Indians, including the chiefs Halatamico and Billy Bowlegs, and with their assistance and by dint of weeks of labor and searching through the Everglades secured 165 of what Rector called the hostile Indians for removal to the west. Of this number 121 were women and children and the remainder warriors. They included 10 of the Miccosukee band, leaving 12 warriors and 5 very old men who declined to emigrate and abandon their venerable but implacable chief Sam Jones, then 108 years old, but promised they would remove after his death. Degree Rector's party sailed from Fort Myers, Florida, May 4 and proceeded by way of New Orleans, the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers, on the steamboat Quapaw. They arrived at Fort Smith May 28, and in a few days, after securing wagons for their transportation, in charge of Rutherford, they proceeded overland, reaching their agency June 16. After their arrival, an epidemic of fever took a number of lives in the party. At last Indian removal was an accomplished fact. The white people had come into possession of the ancestral domain of the Aboriginals. Exulting town boomers, land speculators, and farmers overran the land and appropriated the sites that so recently had been cherished spots, the homes, villages, fields, and burying grounds of the Indians, even while the sad expatriates were toiling over cruel and forbidding highways. With bitter sorrow in their hearts, weakened by hardship and privation, decimated by disease, oppressed by penury, despondent and disheartened, they traveled on. All but hopeless the Indians were as they approached their new home, forbidding and strange. And yet there was a wistful hope of a partial recompense, that in this remote country they would find surcease from the cruelty, sordidness, and rapacity of the frontier white man. Hope that in the country he did not covet and would not have, they would be allowed to live in peace, to restore their broken health and homes, institutions, and governments. With this hope after their arrival, they resolutely attacked the problems of pioneering in the strange country that confronted them. The rehabilitation of these 5 Indian nations, their readjustment to their new surroundings, the recovery of their national spirit and enterprise, the building of their farms and homes, their governments and schools upon the raw frontier, bringing into being a higher civilization of Indians, this was an achievement unique in our history, that compares favorably with the best traditions of white frontier civilization.